All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode eight of the On the Couch podcast, where we talk about Couchform and all the ideas behind it. And today, we're going to be expanding on mechanics. Talk about mechanics and what makes mechanics good for roleplay, and how we can identify them and use them to better support our themes. Uh, but before we get into that, we're going to get into introductions here. We have our guest Waffleslapper here. If you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself, what you do, and all that good stuff.
Hey, my name is Waffleslapper. You probably know me as either Craig or the Lily from either ATK or Aether Chronicles, respectively. I was also the lead dev, I believe, was my term of whatever on OSRP stuff. So I've been the developer for ATK and Blackwell so far. So a lot of my stuff was mechanical and design. So the day-night cycle on Blackwell, a bunch of scene control stuff on ATK. Have done quite a bit of things. I'm also a hardware software validation by trade and a game dev by want and training.
Very cool. And we'll definitely be tapping into some of that experience later on in this discussion because I think it's very, very valuable to kind of look at that and see how all that comes together. Be very
Mm-hmm.
exciting. Uh, Selin, it is our turn.
Yes, I suppose it is.
It is.
Wow. Hi, I'm Silent. I do roleplay in VR occasionally. It's been just a little over 3 years now that I've been roleplaying in VR. Been here and around. Did GMing and I suppose today is the day I mention where I did at least some development work for Worlds Apart with
At
systems
least
and
some.
such. But yeah.
Selin is vastly understating just how crazy the skybox tech was in Warp that she worked on.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right, that was cool.
So
That was
we
fucking
we can
cool.
we can talk about that because it
Yeah.
was too much. That's for sure. I don't know. Anyway, we can talk about that later.
hmm Yeah, we can talk about that later. All right. Where to begin? The temptation to say hi, you know who we are, is getting stronger and stronger every
Mm-hmm.
episode. Um, but I'm Solus. I've been role playing in VR for over 4 years, ever since I waltzed into the Purple Lotus, playing my old school RuneScape character. That was a fun time. Um, I have not necessarily done a huge amount of VR system work for the most part. Yeah, I'm just thinking back to the stuff I made now, and I have done some menu system work, but nothing that's really actually made it out to full production, I guess. So that's I guess something to be excited about when I kick up legacies. I'll actually be doing that. That'll be fun. Um, but yeah, been role playing for that whole time, and have been very interested in the technical side of all of the goings on with roleplay and how those kind of interface with the real time interaction that we expect to have in roleplay with each other in this technical medium. So there's a huge and interesting and difficult balance to strike with something that frankly is just an entirely emergent medium, right? Like we've seen LARP IRL. We know to some degree how that works. We've seen other technical mediums like role playing games that people have role played in. We've seen tabletop happen. And VR to me feels like something that's very different. And I guess this discussion feels very important in a very broad sense because it is one where we kind of look for where that line actually gets drawn. Uh, or at the very least, figuring out what we actually enjoy about these little mechanical things. So very excited for that.
I wanted to say before we go on, I know you haven't done like too much like world slash udon slash that sort of stuff, but I think you've made some like avatar systems,
Mm-hmm.
including one that we'll probably end up talking about later. But anyway.
Oh, I am curious on which one you're referring to. Oh, no, I know which one you're referring to. Ah, shit. Yeah, we are going to talk about that.
Yeah.
The dreaded. Oh, God. I see it everywhere. It haunts me every single day. Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that one later. And I'll also talk about good ones. All right. The pipe was a good one. Anyways. So, to the topic at hand, right? The title of this principle is no game mechanics. But before we get to that, we got to rewind a little bit. We gotta set the foundation, and we gotta talk about. Well, before we even get to the game mechanic part, let's talk about a mechanic. What is a mechanic, right? So just to lay that foundation, we're gonna posit this definition that a mechanic is something that facilitates players interacting with each other and the setting. And that is the very kind of foundational, simple definition that we're going to lay down for it. It is something that facilitates players interacting with each other and the setting. And when we kind of think of it in that really broad sense, there are a lot of kind of examples that we can draw from that are not like necessarily mechanical that we might have thought of before, like a locked door, for instance, right? A locked door is something that facilitates how we engage with buildings, right? How we enter and exit spaces. It being blocked off in some capacity is a way to facilitate that interaction.
And every D&D player ever knows how tough a locked door can be.
Yep, exactly. It does, like, in a way, facilitate other kinds of interaction, right? Like, if you have a locked door and you know it's a place of interest, like, maybe your character might make the decision to break into the place some other way, for example. It like, creates scenarios. But that being said, locked doors, something like an economy, a whole bunch of examples. Can you guys just name off a couple, just to throw some out there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll go a bit more detailed. I think like in the locked door example, I think it like gets even more specific, because like you could imagine the locked door being like an actual thing that you can like interact with and like lock pick the door, or it could be something that a GM narrates to you, and both of those are different mechanics, even though they're both a locked door. So there are kind of different. I think it's more like the means of interaction, right, than what you're actually representing.
Right.
Like the mechanic is the way that you're interacting, more so than the topic of the interaction.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very different kind of interaction when you have the two different sorts of mediums to interact with it, right?
Yeah, this is why like you could perhaps talk about like combat mechanics plural, because there are multiple of them, because there are different ways to go about it, right? And in this context, I don't think I've ever heard somebody say like locked door mechanics, but like you totally could, I think.
Yeah, it's usually in the way of opening said locked door that you refer to the mechanics, so like lock picking or door breaking mechanics or something like that.
The mechanic usually is referencing the action rather than the situation, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that and actually you're right. Lockpicking is the action, right? That is the means of interaction. So,
yeah.
All right.
And I think it is important to note that there are different realms of mechanics as well. You have hard mechanics, so that is games like In Minecraft, you have the block placing and the crafting. Those are hard mechanics. That is how you interact with the world. And then you have soft mechanics, which are something that is a little bit more fluid and ambiguous. So a soft mechanic could be something along the lines of how character creation generally flows, not necessarily like we're going to talk about later, like which edges and flaws, but like how the character might interact with the backstory of the world. I'm doing like this thing with my hands, like doing like this little fluttery figure eight thing. Like you can see me, but I have a PNG at the moment, so
No, I can
it
see
doesn't
you.
quite work. Oh, where? How?
Look outside. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah. So soft mechanics exist. They are basically how the DM will narrate things, how they will have you deal with situations that are not already mired in hard mechanics.
So I guess like a way to summarize that would be hard mechanics are the only gateway to specific outcomes, whereas soft mechanics there are more than one way to get there. I'm trying to draw up the example of like the Minecraft block placing. Like there's only one way to place a block, right?
Yeah.
But if
So
if you create a soft mechanic around that and in some way interacted with the world, that would then result in the block being placed there, and there were multiple ways around that, then that would be soft. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
I would say it's more along the lines of hard mechanics are foundational and soft mechanics are flourish. So in Minecraft, in this
Okay.
example, a hard mechanic would be crafting and block placing, and a soft mechanic would be how, like the server rules, essentially.
Okay.
How it's like a contract about how the different agents in the system interact with one another, but not a hard set mathematical rule.
Hmm. Okay, I see what you're getting at. Yeah. I think yeah, we haven't necessarily gone over that in the principle, but I think it'd be cool
Mhm.
to kind of like intersect that with what we have and see where that fits in. I think that's a
Yeah,
pretty good distinction.
I don't know how I'd define those terms, but I've definitely heard them before. It's usually kind of vibes based in my experience. I will probably think about how I would define those. I've
Mhm.
certainly heard it before.
All right. So, moving on to the meat here. So, we've figured out what a mechanic is. Now, uh the next question that I would posit and hope is within everyone's minds. Okay, think of mechanics first off is what makes a mechanic good for roleplay? And that's a bit of a tricky one because this is exactly what the principle is about ultimately, but it is one that takes a while to kind of bring out of the ground from scratch, right?
So I'm going to answer the question in the least satisfying way possible here. Uh, Depends on the role play.
Mm-hmm. That's about what I was going to say as well.
See,
Because
good.
the every role play is a unique thing,
Mhm.
and this is specifically trying to be exactly something. It's still going to be unique anyway in some fashion. The There are certain things that are more gamified and certain things that are more freeform, or certain role plays rather, not things. Um, and yeah, so you have to go and do some actual mental work to figure out if a mechanic works for you and your
Mhm.
roleplay.
Hmm. That's I suppose probably the first thing that I mean I'm just agreeing here. It's probably like the first thing that I would say is like mechanics aren't necessarily good or bad. What they are is they either do or don't fit your role play.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
that's a more I guess beneficial conversation to have is like, does this mechanic fit my role play?
Absolutely. Right. Because ultimately, this is once again to reiterate this, Couchform is a style of roleplay, and thus these considerations that we make are stylistic, meaning that again, like these two have said, whether or not a mechanic fits for a roleplay is dependent on the roleplay and what kind of structure the roleplay has, what kind of themes they're exploring, et cetera, et cetera. Which then kind of which then kind of leans into this idea of, well, how do we consider that? Right? Like what kind of considerations do we have to make to determine whether something fits a certain roleplay? So to set down the foundation of how we define this to begin with here, this is how we define a roleplay mechanic. And that is a mechanic that is good for the roleplay. Which is to say very little outside of what we've already said, but it's basically the way we distinguish it at a very high level is that the mechanic is not about the mechanic itself. We mentioned it being about the thing that it's facilitating rather than like the actual facilitation itself. So what it is doesn't really matter as much as what it actually represents. And we have 3 criteria in Couchform that we use to measure this. The first is that it evidences a theme of the setting, which is the question, what is it about? So when I think of this, my first thought is look at the roleplay first and really first understand what themes you're exploring in the roleplay. And if you don't already have that, it's already very hard to determine if there's a fit, because if you don't know what you're exploring in the roleplay, then you already have a hard time of figuring out what fits, right? But if you want your mechanic to support your roleplay, it should support what the roleplay is based on, which for us, we base very strongly on themes. So that is how we determine where that fit is.
And from a game design perspective, it's basically the same thing, honestly. In game design, you have to look at what you want for a feature set and figure out if it actually accentuates the actual design you're going for the game. So, like, in the Minecraft example again, you could very easily have a mechanic to drive cars. But it's a block game, so why would you be driving cars? Especially when there's very much no ramps anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't fit the medium. And it doesn't add anything. Horses, however, well, they added stuff to the game before they added elytra, but that's a different story altogether.
I think, like, if I were to recall the very beginning of Minecraft, that the exploration of that was this like exploratory sort of craft your way up to. It really is your quintessential gather resources to create things to gather more resources, but you start out at the surface level where you have to like build to survive, because when it comes nighttime, these creatures come out, so you have to like build your homestead. You have to build everything. You have to build. So a lot of it kind of pushes you to be very sedentary, right? So if you started out with a car, that'd be a bit odd because you're digging down.
Yeah.
So it totally makes sense, right?
Yeah. In game design terms, again, I'm probably gonna be saying that a lot this podcast, but that is called the gameplay loop. It is basically a little state machine that you can envision as to how, excuse me, how your game functions. So in Minecraft, it is mine block, use block to craft thing, use thing to craft, or mine bigger block, use bigger block to craft other thing, to defeat monster, and so on and so forth. In a roleplay, your gameplay loop isn't as stringent and mechanical. It is more a mechanical language to run the show, as it were, if I were to be all flowery about it.
Right. I'm trying to think of like other good examples from like the game space, right? Like if you delve into like JRPGs and some of the ways that they work, the I think a big reason why you have these sort of ramping stories and this like linear uh, progression of threat level from the story perspective is because it's very closely mirrored by the way that the gameplay works. In that you gain your levels by directly gaining experience that gives you strictly stronger things to work with, and that kind of gets mirrored by the content that you actually engage in, which is why like you get your expansions with your level 90 alpacas, right? It's pretty wild to think that that would be like in any way justified when you look at the beginning of the game and you see the end of the game has these like regular animals that are basically world threat level times 100 from like a couple years ago. But then you consider, okay, well the reason why it's like this is because it's not really about the fact that this alpaca is able to end the world 40 levels ago. It's because the progression of this story has made it so that everything else outside has to match it, and the gameplay loop has to keep up with that, and that is the direction that is kind of thematically approached here, is this ever increasing escalation.
To clarify what I mean by gameplay loop, by the way, the gameplay loop is essentially the engine for your game or role play or whatever. And a mechanic is what sticks onto the outside to actually perform a function that makes the engine either run better or do more things. In a JRPG, the base gameplay loop never changes. Unless you're near Automata and then you're just crazy like that. But the in general, like Final Fantasy XIV, the main gameplay loop is the same no matter what expansion you're in, because if it were different, you'd have to teach your players a new quote-unquote language to speak to the game with, and that's just bad game design, usually.
If
Right.
if I may, it's very much talk to people, grind monsters, talk to people, grind monsters, talk to people,
Something
grind
like that.
monsters.
Speak with Muklamat.
Do dungeon, don't stand in fire, you know.
Look for the orange marker. Don't be in the orange marker when it
Speaking
goes
of
away.
role-playing games,
Yeah.
Yep.
it's,
There it is.
yeah, Solus, can I quick petition to change the wording here from mechanic is good for roleplay to mechanic fits roleplay. I just like said that off the cuff, but it just like feels better.
Roleplay mechanic is a mechanic that fits the roleplay. Yeah,
Well,
I
it could
like
be
it.
both, right?
Is good for and fits. I mean,
It's like it you know, takes away from like the mechanic being like inherently good or bad, like universally, you know.
that's fair. Yeah.
Um,
I think good for the roleplay maybe solves that.
the roleplay, your roleplay,
Maybe.
whatever.
Yeah.
We'll think about it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We'll workshop that.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between mechanics that are good for your roleplay and mechanics that facilitate roleplay in general.
Yeah. And there are definitely some like common factors between role plays that kind of make some mechanics really helpful across the board too. So those are something we can discuss later too. We'll move on to the second point just so we can move forward here. The second criteria we use is that it prompts roleplay. So what does it affect is the question that we ask there. And generally speaking, for a mechanic to result in interesting moments with players, it kind of has to prompt that, right? You don't want a mechanic to pull players apart because it will means they interact less, and that means they interact less with the mechanic, which is generally pretty awful. So you definitely want to create these sort of alibis for interaction that you don't. Yeah.
Unless you're crazy and you want specifically your theme is isolation, maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe then you're pulling people apart, but otherwise.
Well, I guess even then,
kind of being a thing where the main mechanic for isolation is how to eventually talk to one another in fleeting moments here and there, or something like that.
maybe. I could also see like the facilitation of interaction to prompt roleplay maybe also just prompts the player to interact with certain elements of the world, right? So it still prompts roleplay.
I suppose the thing that popped in my head the moment you said like, pulling players together is like the exact opposite. I found the game Poem, which is just like a really 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 short role play, um, which it was like letter writing on kind of you're like sending like emails essentially to each other aboard spaceships that are like going in opposite directions, basically. So like at the start of the game, it's like semi turn based because it's like letter writing. You're essentially like sending messages to the other person. Like at the beginning of the game, it's I say semi turn based because it's like going in real time, right? Like one turn is like 1 minute or something, right? And like at the beginning of the game, like the message takes like a minute to get there, and like by the end of the game, it's taking longer for the messages to get there, and like eventually like the message never gets there, and like you just don't have like a round trip time. So like that was a mechanic that is literally pulling people apart.
But that does facilitate roleplay still. It facilitates interaction on a limited time scale, where if you don't get what you want done fast enough, you won't be able to get it done at all because they are thousands of light years in the other direction and you can't get a signal there.
How long does it take a signal to travel thousands of light years?
About 1,000 years.
I've been waiting for this email for centuries.
As per my last email I sent in 23 BCE.
Oh no.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just like how my brain works. Is you say something and I just think the opposite. But
yeah.
Anyway, yeah. That was just the example that popped in my head.
Right.
Just now.
But it is like a good example of like it doesn't necessarily need to bring people together because it does in its own way prompt certain kinds of roleplay between characters. Yeah. Like if you act on something that someone sent you, that then prompts you to speak to some other players within your spaceship going that certain direction about something about whatever mission you're on. Then it suddenly created an opportunity for interaction that you wouldn't have had before, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is something you can talk about. Yeah, that is true.
All right, number 3, third and last criteria here is that it abstracts from something. What does it represent is the question. Because in VR roleplay especially, we tend to interface with a lot of very large things, large ideas, or perhaps just concepts that are really hard to fully explore, maybe for the sake of time or scale or technical limitations or whatever have you, that normally having these mechanics that sort of simplify down these artifacts to help us engage with them more easily is generally a very preferable thing to have. And what ends up happening when we have a mechanic that doesn't do this is that the mechanic doesn't just represent the thing that it does, but it also actually does that thing. So it tends to amount to this sort of simulation, which can often become tedious.
This is possibly the part where I and Solus disagree the most.
Mm-hmm. That's true. This one sparked a very long discussion. This is why. So just to give you guys a little background knowledge here of how this principle came into effect here, is that what I originally wrote up to present this mechanic was very different. It was not at all this, and then this came from a revision where I ended up talking to a lot of people and kind of compiling this information together. And the prefacing to the 3 criteria was that a roleplay mechanic must do all these 3 things, and the discussion we went through have kind of boiled that down to a roleplay mechanic : and then the 3 points: evaluate or evidence the theme of the setting, prompts roleplay, and abstracts from something. So originally it was must, and then we kind of pulled away from that quite a bit for the sake of it doesn't necessarily need to abstract from something. But it is very often the case that this does work very well for the mechanic and the roleplay. So it is one of those like situational
This
things.
last one, I'm personally not convinced that you strictly need to abstract from something, but I do agree that reducing complexity is generally good in the limited amount of time that we have in a role play. Generally, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how you might rephrase or rethink that to be more foundational. Because I see where you're coming from with it. It's a mechanic is a way to, in both roleplay and gaming, it is a way to communicate with the game state.
Mm-hmm.
So in real life, you can't just place down a cubic meter of dirt in front of you. You actually have to like do a whole bunch of other stuff. But in Minecraft, it's just a right click. The mechanic is there to facilitate rapid building because that's part of the gameplay. Like you build stuff, you mine stuff, you craft stuff. It's all that fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In roleplay, a mechanic is there to have the players be able to communicate with each other and the game state in a way that's not just saying things. So, like, I know you we're gonna talk about the D20 later on, but the most common one is rolling a dice to add a little bit of randomness into the situation in order to be like, I'm gonna do a thing, so I'm going to roll this platonic solid in order to figure out if I've done the thing or not. And instead of actually physically doing the thing with your hands or your knowledge or whatever, you put it up to chance. And that's the mechanic. It's a random chance mechanic.
I'm holding back. It's right. The opportunity's
Yeah,
there.
we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, like I very much agree. Like I'm a big fan of like reducing complexity. I'm just not sure exactly like I personally visualize this principle here is like a test. It's intended to be like somewhat of a test where like if you have a role play mechanic, you can like test it against these criteria to try and figure out if it fits your role play or not. And this third one here to me feels like it's definitely a good thing. It doesn't feel like it's like the way it's written. It doesn't really feel like a useful test though. And like I think it's kind of hard because I do agree. I think most mechanics do abstract and simplify concepts.
Yeah.
But
I
like I think the example that I had, I think the example that we spent a long time arguing about was actually in and here's my power button. Like there are a couple of things there which like you could perhaps argue, right? Like you could perhaps argue that for those who don't know, here's my power button is like it's a role play not written by me, but I made a world for it in VR chat. And one of the features of that world is that there is this big circular room with kind of 8 booths around it. And if you go into a booth, it kind of mutes the other audio from other people in the room, so you can focus on the conversation with the person that's in front of you. And like I feel like you could argue that, this is abstracting the concept of being in separate rooms. But mind you, if you go back to like the original like LARP documentation of Here's My Power Button, the way that they solved this is they basically played musical chairs, and they would position their chairs in either 2 rows of 8, like kind of like facing each other, or in like 2 groups of 8. And they would kind of like move their chairs back and forth. And you could also argue, well, hey, this also abstracts the concept of being in separate rooms, right? Like if you move your chairs apart, then you're in separate rooms now.
So, if I were to take a stab at why you, Celine, might have an issue with this being a criteria, I think calling it a that a mechanic needs to have an abstraction from something, or needs to be an abstraction from something, is more definitive than qualitative. So a mechanic is a way to abstract away from reality to interact with the game state. I think that is more a definition of what a mechanic is rather than a necessary way to say this mechanic is good for a role play, if you get what I mean.
I think I'm struggling. I think actually the test is where it thrives, because if you do start with what the mechanic is and you already kind of know the ins and outs of like what you plan to do, and then you put it up to this third criteria, then you already at that point are being confronted with like what it might represent, and you can kind of compare contrast with what the mechanic is versus what it represents. Like if you are looking at, like, for example, an economic system, and you realize that you've basically created an in-world economy one-to-one, then you can think about how to abstract from that, and then that can help you better represent that economy without bogging everyone down with the details. So I think it actually works well for the test, but I do agree that like stamping the needed label on this without having thought of the mechanic first is definitely a huge ask.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time using that as a criterion to say this is a roleplay mechanic rather than a game mechanic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of like struggle with that. I would probably argue that like something, for example, like in VR, like pinging a GM, I would argue is a form of mechanic as well, regardless of whether or not it like contained inside the roleplay world. It is kind of like facilitating interaction between people in a way still. So yeah, I guess that's why like. I agree that it's generally a good thing. I'll agree insofar as that, and that's why I suppose it's still in the document. But it's pretty funny. This line in particular, like this bullet point, is probably like the thing that Solus and I like disagreed on the most.
Absolutely.
So,
yep.
Sylvan, in your vision of this definition, what would you say? Well, actually, Solus, rather. I'm going to point this at you. In your vision of this, what mechanic would not be an abstraction from something or for something?
Hard economy.
And that is not an abstraction from actually coins and paper money exchanging hands?
Well, the way I kind of define that with a hard economy is that everything is tracked and circulated through the roleplay itself. We like any roleplay that specifically puts these sort of hard prices and tracks the transactions between the players, that they have to actually transactionally interact with each other to achieve things through the economy, means that they are effectively making an economy.
So what I might recommend as a change in verbiage for this point is less that needs to be an abstraction, but rather it needs to streamline the way the characters interact with the game state. Because in calling it an abstraction, a hard economy is still an abstraction from reality, where paper money isn't changing hands in real life because you're in VR or across a table, unless you're actually playing for real money for some reason. Whereas a hard economy in roleplay acts against streamlining communicating with the game state, because you have to go and do accounting before you can actually figure out whether or not your character can actually do the thing and buy the thing.
Right.
So perhaps that might fit a little bit better for the definition for point 3.
I see what you're getting at. Okay. This will be kept in mind.
Noted.
Noted. To close out the criteria here before we get to some of the big examples, these are the 3 criteria that we currently have for what makes a mechanic a roleplay mechanic, and anything that fails these criteria in a large enough way makes it a game mechanic. And in the very broad sense, these game mechanics become self-referential, they become tedious, and they often require the player to deviate from the roleplay to experience them. Which is why us kind of pursuing this sort of thematic core for these roleplays, we define this to kind of create this distinction of this is what a roleplay mechanic is. Anything outside of that is something we don't actually want in the roleplay. So the discussion with how we actually create these mechanics and how we think about them is to think about how do they fit these criteria to help us gauge whether they're good for our roleplays.
So, quick reminder before we move on. I know we've already mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. In this context, when we say we, it's like literally we, as in myself and Solace, because we're just talking about what the way that we think mechanics should be done, in as far as Couchform exists, right? So
Yeah.
That's I think that is just like really important to state. Where this is like a specific flavor of roleplay in which we value these things in our mechanics. We want our mechanics to be like this in our roleplays.
Right, exactly. And I would say even under this definition, right, this still does absolutely open the room for the mechanic that is a roleplay mechanic in one roleplay, but a game mechanic in another, because roleplays operate under different thematic cores, which means if you have one, just as a very basic example, a mechanic that fits a roleplay that explores like horror and scarcity, that you then bring it over to like a different roleplay that is far different. It's like maybe like a heroic story or something. It's probably not going to fit, and it becomes something that detracts from the roleplay a bit, which makes it a game mechanic under our definition. So I would like to bring out some examples, and we could talk about examples now before we get to the big ones. I want to bring up two from Neon Divide as passing and failing examples. I'm going to start with a failing one so we end on a positive note. I am very particularly not fond of weapons in roleplay for a lot of reasons. Because generally, what they end up doing, especially when you have a starkly PvP sort of environment, is that they push characters away from each other often, unless you have a very good idea of how they're supposed to facilitate the interactions between each other. Because there are ways to have weapons facilitate different and interesting interactions. But oftentimes what it does is it creates this sort of fear response. And it definitely does kind of, in some ways, represent the theme of the setting, in that the cyberpunk kind of rebel against the system and poverty sort of aesthetic definitely gets hit there, depending on how much you delve into which kind of weapons people can have. Because as soon as they start getting the high-tech stuff, then it starts to like push away from that a little bit. And that kind of starts to break down a little bit, especially with like the progression systems that you tend to get around weapons. Like, how do I get a better weapon? How do I get the stronger stuff? Which tends to sort of happen with these systems. So that I would say is like kind of the potential failure point. But the good example, one of the mechanics I think ND really thrived from, like Neon Divide did super well, was vehicles, specifically the Wasteland. Because I'm going to go through the three criteria here, just so we like really nail this down, right? So evidence is the theme of the setting. The vehicles, evidence, the kind of quote-unquote hunter-gatherer sort of aesthetic of the Wasteland, where the people had to provide for themselves, being unsupported by anyone up top. Ideally, that was kind of the thematic purpose of that. They represent independence, because when you are out there in your car, you are in control of your own destiny out in the open. And the open is dangerous. So it is a representation of man's resilience against dangerous environments. Right. So it just keeps going. How much that opened up, right? And speaking of open up, prompts roleplay. It prompts players to go out in groups and experience different things inside the vast openness of the wasteland. It opens up basically the entire map to them. So unique experience out in this open, along with like, grabbing a bunch of people as supporting cast to kind of drive around them and have this sort of like player versus raider sort of mini conflict. So you get some extra roleplay opportunities out of that. And then it abstracts from like much larger expeditions, because and it also abstracts from nomadic lifestyle. I mean, like you would generally understand that outside in that sort of wasteland environment that you probably wouldn't stay in the same place for very long. That's why all of these structures are sort of makeshift. But you abstract away from that by not having the place move and instead have the people move around the cars, and that just helps immensely with kind of pushing away from that, lowering the time scope quite a bit, and still having the map be as travelable as possible. I mean, the Wasteland was, to my understanding, the biggest map in Neon Divide out of the 4, and was still easily the most traversed because obviously you had the vehicles to do so. But on top of that, there's just so much potential for how much you can connect via that system. Oh.
So if I were to bring up a pass and fail, is it all right if I do this twice in a row? Because I've got one for 2 of my projects.
Go for it.
So for the passing one, and before I get into this, I'm just going to say that as full transparency, I worked on both of these, and I was part of a team on both of these. None of the negative things I'm about to say are an indictment on anyone. It is just an observation on how these things worked and how they did not. So to start off with, I'm actually going to disagree with you a little bit here, Solus.
Oh.
One of my passing things is the weapon mechanics in ATK. And that is because they did not actually check to see where the player was hit. What they did was they did a bunch of fancy stuff, like you could have bullet ricochet and material piercing and all that fun stuff. But that was just flavor on top of it. The main thing that made it a pass for me is that when a bullet traveled next to a player using a bunch of math, it would play a bullet crack effect, like you hear the snap as it goes by your head, and a slight dimming vignette around your screen saying, "Oh, that was a really close hit or shot," and then the player could decide whether or not they took that hit. So it was not a game mechanic, because if it were, it would be like tracking what limb was hit, or they would be doing a roll to see if you were hit or not. It was basically just, here's a notification for the player saying, this happened near you. Do you want to act on it? So I believe the third criteria there about abstracting or streamlining, or however you want to say it, is there because there's no dice roll to say you were hit or you weren't hit. The or the first two again.
So
it's not in the topic.
The first two. Let me direct you to the Couchform link. I'm actually going to put it in chat. There we go. Core principles right up there. It's number 8. So I will. I actually kind of want to respond to that because yes, I do agree that ATK did it well. Because one thing I didn't mention before is when you do have weapons, they often resemble control, right? The person who has the bigger weapon generally has the more control in a situation and can use it to control other people, strike fear into them, etc. So that by really pushing into how those weapons control people via like these near-death experiences, for example, the bullet whizzes by, you hear the crack, like that is something that supports that sort of theme of the danger of these weapons. They're very dangerous, right? That this is toying with the fabric of your very being, which is wild. And if you really think about like the essence of control, you could go as far as like historic implications of the Cold War, right? Like the whole nuclear arms race. No one ended up firing anything off to each other, but just having the weapons there,
Big stick.
yeah, it created decades of tension where it's just anything could have happened and anything still can happen, but it's very clear evidence of the fact that weapons have that sort of controlling effect. So when you base a system instead of like off of what exactly happens when you get hit by them and how much of a big weapon you can get versus like the ATK approach of how the players perceive the weapons and what happens when you're confronted with those sort of near experiences with it, I think that just works so much better. So I actually very much agree with you.
So, sorry, you first.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to chime in on the weapons as well because, like, from my perspective, like, I think you can definitely I think depending on the kind of like the topic of the role play, right? Kind of like paranoia is definitely like a killer, and weapons can lead to that. I think like that's not necessarily a bad thing. In like my experience, being in gang role play, what we had a lot of was not so much that like weapons were doing that. It's more so that specifically guns were doing that. In the sense of being in that role play, it very much felt that guns were very impersonal. Like being in a shootout was a very impersonal experience. You were basically just like hiding behind the wall and not really interacting with the person on the other side, right? Whereas like being in like a sword fight or like a knife fight is a very personal, is potentially can be a very personal experience.
Yeah.
And we actually had a rule in Gengarp. It was kind of like a band-aid fix. I'm not like advocating as for this as like a good fix, but it was like a band-aid fix of like we would start every mission with melee only because nobody wanted to just do guns the whole time, right? Because guns the whole time kind of suck because it's super impersonal.
Yep.
And yeah.
Yeah,
I did also
I
want
see,
to.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I did also really quickly want to mention the control part because my goodness, I actually posted it in this channel. We had that LARP mechanic of like you pull out like a knife, and that represents that you're controlling the person who's in front of you. So you get to control where they move and like where they stand and where they move, and they can't do anything about it until you put the knife away. And when you take out a gun, that represents that you control the room. The entire room that you are in control of, and you get to kind of like give commands and like where people go until you decide to put the gun away. And of course, it was in the rules that you are expected to put that gun away after, you've had your scene. But I really like that one. That was a really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a really interesting way to approach it. What I was trying to interject there is that a gun being impersonal is, I would say, because a bullet, once fired, will not hesitate or pull when it is about to hit you. A knife, however, can be deflected or, you can make the other person hesitate.
Right.
Whereas a gun, you just pull a button and it's done.
The guns are, I think, more about who's next to you, in a sense, which I think can potentially be done. But the who's next to you, I think, doesn't work very well in like a PvP context, as well, right? But in like gun combat is more about like who's next to you, who's behind you, who's supporting you, rather than who you're against.
Right. And also like just the I guess if you're pulling into the more player interacting with world aspect, like once the bullet leaves the chamber, then how do you perceive it? If it's just like a line or a particle with a trail, then that's like one thing. If you do have the sort of audio feedback, then it's like now you're actually focusing on that interaction, which certainly helps.
So to go back to the weapons in ATK as a passing version of this, um, the evidence is a theme of the setting. It is the setting of ATK is a bleak diesel punk version of the future where everyone is basically frontier survivors. It's kill or be killed, and a gun is perfect for that because it's mostly impersonal. You are there to do a mission. The other people are there to survive, and well, actually, everyone's there to survive, really. But the attackers, the players in this regard, are there to complete a mission and get paid so they can survive, whereas the other side is trying to not get shot and survive. So a gun being that way is perfectly impersonal. And of course, it prompts roleplay because have gun is threat.
Right.
And of course, the last one abstracts or streamlines. As Bronk said in chat, it that whole ability to determine whether or not you can take that hit. Like if you're behind cover and you get the snap, it'll probably hit the cover. But if you're out in the open and you hear the snap and you're not like able to dive to the ground, you've probably potentially taken a hit there. And that was really useful for the NPC side because this was a very, very PvE roleplay rather than PvP. So our missions encountered a lot of Op4 players. So the players on the Sportcast played the faceless bandits who are being shot for the C-bills and all that fun stuff. And they could use that to be like, oh, I'm being shot at by a player. I should probably act accordingly.
Right.
No, I think regardless, I suppose I'm going to attempt to not to talk about NPCing here, but I think like I suppose this kind of like fits in with like the way that I was thinking about reason guns really didn't work in gang roleplay is because it was actually, I would say the missions on average were generally more like you would in game terms you would probably consider it PvE more often than not. Mm-hmm. But the kind of like the plot of that was I mentioned earlier where like guns are more about who's next to you. In gang roleplay, it was very much about like who is your enemy, right? Like we had two separate gangs that were like separate but also working together, and there was like a lot of drama between like the enemies there, right? And like guns kind of took all that away, right? And it kind of like took apart that core of like it was very much about like who is your enemy? Are they actually your enemy, right? I suppose in the terms of like if you had like okay, we don't care who our enemies are, we care who our friends are, right? It's more about like our relationships with our friends. Then in that context, right, like guns distance you from your enemies and kind of pull you closer to the people next to you.
I think at that point I would look for the space between the shots to really understand where the mechanic is actually helping or hurting. Because if there's not much space between the shots and a lot of it is about kind of using it to push in the way that you need to against whoever the enemy is, then you tend to lose a lot of the value in the who's your enemy sort of drama that you're actually looking for. Whereas I think where ATK sort of kind of thrives with this is between the space of like when you are just trying to survive and shoot out the enemy, that you are given other things to react to and to experience that aren't necessarily just I'm trying to win this encounter, but are specific things to react to and interact differently.
Yeah, in the setup for ATK, the missions were posited as The support cast were obstacles, essentially. They were the mechanic in that regard. You had to kill or be killed, and they were standing in your way to complete the objective. The I was going to say something, or where to go? I lost it. Ah!
You'll get it, I believe. I don't know about support cast as mechanic. Maybe I would say like they're the subject of
Well,
it.
like their existence and strategies were part of the mechanical conversation, as it were,
Sure,
between
yeah.
the players and the objective of the game, as it were, because ATK's missions were a fair whack more gamified than a full freeform RP.
Yeah.
Not full gamified, but it was still more than baseline.
Mm-hmm. It's a mission style of like we have a goal and there are certain waypoints to progress to the goal, and we're using the mechanic to facilitate that.
Yeah, and I think um, to what Sylvan was saying basically reminded me of how the way we handled the actual big bad of Mission One was Goblin, the main uh, antagonist, I guess, from one of the characters' backstories, was there to terrorize the players. He was wily and he was quick, so he couldn't really be killed from afar by guns. You had to get in close and actually, take him out. And he wouldn't. They couldn't even kill him in the first mission anyway. So basically, he got away before the players could do anything about it. He was basically the Joker in that regard. He was there to cause the havoc and be back later to try to reprise, but ultimately the players win. That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the guns were almost useless against him because he was only ever out in the open for a show of force, and he darted away before he could get shot when he saw that the players were training the weapons on him and started firing. And he was also insane. So
It's very much like speaks to the understanding that we had before talking about like big bads that are like specifically uh denotated as evil, that they are effectively used as like narrative devices to kind of unite players that under some sort of common cause.
Well, it is a little tangential, but I would say that Goblin was not specifically evil. Like he had evil streaks. Like he took on the blow up the orphanage missions a lot more than that one character would like, and that's why he left. And he was also insane. But he was only ever out for himself. It was the D&D alignment version of evil, where he was self-serving rather than I kick puppies.
Okay. Yeah, I see the angle. All right. All right. So, do we have any more examples to talk on before we get on the big ones?
We have tangented. I think Waffle, you had another one.
Yeah, so I was going to say about mechanics that did not work in 8K, or a mechanic. And I would say, sadly, anything to do with mech missions. Because they didn't really have any player agency to them. I never got the mechs actually working by the time we went live, so they couldn't actually pilot anything. So instead of that, the DMs ran basically a little simulated game of BattleTech to figure out who got hit, who did what, and they basically had the story happen, or the players had the story happen at them. They got a recap of what happened during the mission and were basically given the results of that as a scene prompt rather than actually being able to partake in the thing that their characters are trained and paid to do. So mechanically, that while it does evidence the theme of the setting, they dropped in mechs and they did mech things. There was no roleplay prompting, and it didn't streamline or abstract away from. Well, it did sort of. They streamlined away from having to do anything with mechs. So that didn't really work.
Right. It took away from prompting roleplay by just not prompting it.
Yeah, and the major failing there makes the other two, well, one pass and one okay pass, it just kind of wipes them away. I'd say it was a complete failure there.
Yeah, that's fair.
It could have been done better, and I hope that in the future it will be done better.
Yeah.
And I did say that I want to do this twice. That last tangent or that last section did take a sec. Would you mind if I did another one for Blackwell as well?
I say go for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Mechanic that passed for Blackwell. I would say that the day-night cycle and how we treated darkness was its own mechanic, and it passes this test.
I agree.
Because the day-night cycle was always running, everyone had a visual tracking of how much daylight they had left before the spookies came out because the sun was moving. Simpods were nice for NPCs, however, is able to interact with each other. Yeah, that it worked as a nice toy in 80k. But for Blackwell, the day-night cycle, it evidenced the theme because the theme was basically bad things happen in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And it prompts roleplay because everyone has to get their shit done before it gets dark and they have to go indoors or brave the darkness outside for something else because the devil's tears rather, only bloomed at night and they weren't harvestable during the day. And it's abstracted away from the passage of time. It streamlined narration of the sun going down, and we could play with that automatically in the roleplay as it progressed by adjusting the time of day curve that I had in there. So we could actually have it set so twilight and like sunrise or sunset would last longer per minute, and then like the day would be shorter and then the nighttime would be really long compared to everything else. So we could adjust that to have shorter and shorter days as the roleplay went on to make the characters more uneasy because they have less and less light during the run. Meow.
That was good. That was incredible. Yeah, I actually one of the examples that really pushed me toward this understanding of roleplay mechanics is actually that flower that you referenced. And that it really is sort of benign when you think about it at a very surface level, that it's just a flower that is used in a plague tincture. But the fact that it specifically blooms at night in a roleplay where the darkness is core to experiencing the horror and helplessness of the roleplay, that is like the exact goal to experience the themes, is to put these players in these sort of helpless situations where they're out on their own and vulnerable and terrified. That flower alone, just blooming at night and forcing players to make decisions about how they're going to effectively put themselves in danger to get this thing, is pretty. It's pretty insane how much of a positive impact that has on the roleplay itself. Not only just mirroring the themes, but creating these sort of opportunities.
I would say that mechanic also passes all three tests here.
Yeah.
The theme is, of course, bad things happen in the dark. There's a plague on the horizon that people can get. It prompts roleplay because you have to gather people to go out into the swamps at night, and it abstracts away from actual like plant mechanics or whatever, and it streamlines the fact that you can actually go and get something.
Yeah, because it's like in the end, the whole this is actually why I wrote the phrase "it's not about the mechanic," right? The flower isn't important. The plague isn't even important. What's important is what happens because of it.
Yeah. It's a facilitation of a story.
Yeah.
And now here is the bit that is going to throw your system for a little bit of a loop.
All right.
There was a mechanic, base mechanic in Blackwell that I do not think worked well to its advantage. And that would be the mining and farming of resources. It evidenced the theme of the setting, where one of the themes of the setting was scarcity. Yep. Everyone had their jobs, and everyone had a fixed number of resources that they could provide per day. And those resources were either base resources like lumber or iron ore or something like that, which they would take to a crafter to turn into more refined stuff like lumber to planks or lumber to tools, and iron ore to iron bars to the blacksmith so they can make swords or whatever. Um, so it was an evidence of a theme. It prompted roleplay because you needed these people to gather around and get all these bits and pieces together so they could survive the night. And it abstracted away from actually going and grabbing base resources to start a crafting system. It technically fits all three of these, but I'd call it a not good roleplay mechanic in totality. Mainly because it was a chore rather than a challenge.
Right.
Quackers would probably say that he enjoyed his time in the mines, and that's fine. But the fact of the matter is, you had to put in actual manual labor. So I guess you could actually call that a failure of point 0.3. You actually had to put in actual manual labor to hit the node up to like 50 times for the thing to actually crap out the resource. And
I think the trees were 100 times. I know this because people were complaining about it.
Yeah.
And they counted.
It was excessive, to be sure. Even as someone who worked on the thing, I understand why it took so long and so much effort. And that was to slow down the generation of resources. Right. So you didn't just clear all your chores to begin with.
Right.
But the fact of the matter remains that this was a chore, not a roleplay mechanic.
Okay.
In fact, I would call this probably a bad game mechanic as well.
So I think... Go on.
This is slightly tangential, because I think like, hi, I'm Silent, I do math.
Hi, Silent.
This is, I feel like the sort of like resource gathering and like scarcity argument, and I'm like trying to actually write something up on this. It's proving to be a bit harder because like I can't like definitively be like it's always going to happen like this all the time, because it's kind of like hard to write about it because there are so many kind of like so many exceptions. But I'm going to talk about dynamical systems really quickly. So here, imagine, you know, we have like the hypothetical role play where we have a bunch of crafters. I'm just going to call them crafters. They're generating some amount of resources, right? Mm-hmm. Like per session, you know? Yeah. And then also people are using some amount of resources per session. Probably kind of like, you know, generation usually depends on how many crafters you have. And the kind of the usage of resources usually depends on how many people you have in total, roughly, you know. This is inherently a flawed system. There are only two possible eventualities. This is I won't go into exactly why this happens. If you're interested, you can look into dynamical systems and such. But there are essentially only two possibilities in this system. Either the system, you're generating fewer resources than you're consuming, and in that case, nobody's going to have anything all the time, basically, right? You're always going to have to go and do the chores because you're generating fewer resources than people are consuming, so nobody has anything all the time. Or you're going to have a surplus. You're generating too many resources, more resources than you're consuming, and then you're always going to have a resource and you're never going to have scarcity. Mm-hmm. The situation in which you're generating exactly the amount that you're consuming is what's called it's essentially an unstable equilibrium, meaning if you just nudge the system like slightly higher or slightly lower, you're going to go off to either having a surplus or having nothing. it's incredibly difficult to like set up one of these systems because it is inherently unstable, and you will pretty much always have either a large surplus or nothing at all. And neither of those eventualities is very fun to be on the receiving end of. And and kind of like attempting to balance the system is like, attempting to, balance a, kind of like a broom on its end, right? Or something. It's unstable. It's going to fall over in one way or the other.
The fact of the matter is, the Blackwell system was intentionally designed so that scarcity would happen as the roleplay goes on, because people kept dying, and the base resources or the people who process them would no longer be alive to do so, and someone would either have to pick up the slack or they'd have to do without. So there is definite logic behind it, but the actual creation of said resources, especially the raw resources, didn't help the roleplay, I feel. And of course, as I mentioned before, this is not an indictment on anyone's ideas or anything like that. This is just an observation of what worked and what did not. And I believe that the farming of base resources did not work for Blackwell's favor.
Yeah, we are all about the productive criticism here.
Yeah.
So I actually two comments there. One is that I'm not necessarily convinced. Like, this is a full agreement. I'm not necessarily convinced that the notion of simulating scarcity through the evolution of a system is always a valid interpretation of the system's value, because of situations like that where you create a system to meet an equilibrium that is the intention of the system, that then gets disrupted to evidence the roleplay changing. It feels like the mechanic is changing because of the roleplay rather than the roleplay is changing because of the mechanic. It is just like the direction. And usually you want a mechanic to affect something.
Yeah.
So if it's just mirroring it and only doing that, then you're kind of losing out a bit. And the second point I have is that I would actually argue that this one fails number 2, prompting roleplay, for a couple reasons. And this is why I actually put this all the way at the end of it, and I feel like it should be a bigger point. But I'll go over the part 1 first. The part 1 is that it creates these needs for people to do chores. So they are they may end up doing them with other people, but the general reality of it is they have to do something. They have to collect something. They have to go to this node out in the distance, collect it, and then come back to where the people are normally, which is usually something that takes you away from other roleplay opportunities, and it doesn't actually generate any opportunities itself. The second part of that is that the opportunities that it does generate to put these resources together is almost entirely transactional. And this is like my biggest point against hard economy in role plays, is that it tends to do this as well, where when people are incentivized to role play with each other to get to get things crafted or to buy items, it usually is only that, where they come up, they say, I need 7 pieces of leather, that'll be 49 copper coins. They make the trade, they say thank you, have a nice day, whatever, and they leave. And that's the scene, right? But that's a dead scene. That is, I guess that could really come down to like how the players are handling the scenes in the end. Like, you could really kind of get down a micro level of that. But the macro is that this is the roleplay that the mechanic is effectively incentivizing, because the more time that you spend on these large amount of smaller interactions to specifically fulfill the system, the less time you have doing other things, which is kind of the goal of the roleplay, is to do not just the system, not just the crafting to get other things, but to like get to the end point where you get the interesting roleplay out of the system, because on its own it's not really doing that. So I would say it does fail number 2 on that.
I'm not so sure it completely does fail number 2.
Sure.
Because in its tedium, there is something to be said about it bringing people together to complete the task. Like there were multiple lumberjacks to cut down the trees, and so they could ask for help and whatnot to actually get this thing done. There were multiple miners who went down into the dark to get some precious resources. So there was stuff there. And while it may not have prompted roleplay immediately, it did prompt roleplay in the long run as resources started getting scarcer and scarcer
Right.
because they had to go and deal with the lack of resources, make trades, buy stuff off of people, steal if they had to. I think happened at least once.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say that it didn't prompt roleplay. I would say that it, as you said before, it prompted transactional roleplay, which isn't high quality,
Uh,
but it also was something to rally around for some people as a kind of hardship roleplay.
That was a reaction, Selin.
yeah. I have a couple of things. It's kind of been like I've been kind of like stacking up a few things. I could probably go down rapid fire here.
Okay.
They are related. I'll start with the transactional stuff. I do a lot of improv as well. There is like a principle in improv, which is it's not really a principle, right? Like rules are made to be broken in improv, but like there is a principle to never do transactional scenes in an improv scene. And this is something that kind of like new improvisers get told, and there's a very good reason for it. Transactional scenes kind of suck from like a character's perspective. A scene in which like one character and transactional, I'll define it really quickly here. It's a transactional scene is kind of any scene that's about kind of the exchange of goods and services. And there are a couple of like weaknesses with transactional scenes. If all you have in your scene is a transaction, you don't learn anything about your characters. Nothing really, and like nothing really happens. Like from a character level, you don't learn anything about either character, and nothing really happens. It is incredibly challenging. It's not impossible, but it is incredibly challenging to take a transactional scene and make it not be about the transaction. Like actually like orchestrating like the haggling or like, you know, whatever exchange of currency usually tends to take the spotlight. And it really shouldn't. Now, it's not impossible to have a transactional scene be about the characters, but this is something that you generally tell new improvisers because it is exceedingly hard to do. Like, really, really, really difficult. And
So,
I don't see it done well very often.
would it be correct to say that the roleplay for a transactional scene happens in spite of the transaction rather than because of the transaction?
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Generally that is the case. It is something that can be handled, but has to be handled. Because if you don't know how to handle it, then it's just going to be about the transaction, and you essentially have a dead scene that doesn't like if what you care about is, you know, characters and like character development or like, you know, themes and like, you know, any of these things, none of that is a transactional scene doesn't actually facilitate any of that usually. At least in the context of like, you know, like money and bartering. Favors maybe, right? Favors might tell you something about the characters and like what they want or don't want. But even those can be like a bit difficult. Then you need like things to support that. All right. And kind of like what I would posit in kind of like the like with transactional scenes here is that like giving the opportunity for something is not the same as prompting it, right? Like a transactional scene does like needing something, right? Needing to buy something does provide you with the opportunity to have a scene, but it doesn't really prompt roleplay. If anything, even though it gives you the opportunity to have a scene with somebody else, it also kind of gets in the way of that same scene that it gives you the opportunity for at the same time. So you need kind of like something else there if you're going to be doing that. I'll actually give a kind of like a separate example of like related to this of another mechanic that I think failed in the same way from Worlds Apart this time. Solus, you kicked off this segment by talking about vehicles in Neon Divide, and you were talking about how like the wasteland was big, and like that encouraged people to kind of go out in groups, and like that kind of prompts roleplay. And I've not been in the Undivide, definitely not been on the Wasteland, so I have no idea how that works. But here's how it didn't work in Worlds Apart. We intentionally made that map large, specifically with this intention of like, okay, we're going to make this map large to encourage people to go out in groups. And that worked. I have I can like I actually have like data about this that worked 100%. Making people travel large distances will encourage them to travel in groups. However, I personally think this still kind of failed as a mechanic, and the reason it failed is because the reason people were going out in groups is because of boredom, right? They would be bored otherwise, and that's not a good that's not a good kind of state to be in. We don't want to kind of prompt people to get together because they're going to be bored otherwise, right? Now, I wasn't in Neon Divide, but the alternative of this, where it's like you're getting together because of something, right? Because you actually want to be together. That's, I think, a much better way to prompt people to get together rather than get together because I don't want to be bored, and kind of transactional scenes kind of fall into kind of like a similar category, like in my brain here, where it's like you get a scene out of a transaction, but it's kind of like in spite of the transaction rather than because of it, right? You can get people to get together if they're traveling a long distance, but if you're not careful, if you don't have something else there, it's going to be in spite of the long distance that people are getting together rather than it's they're getting together for a negative reason, not a positive reason.
Yeah, that it does seem to be pretty well the same reason why I didn't like the mining mechanics in Blackwell as well, because they got together to band against the mechanic rather than to revel in it, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, like Solid said with the Neon Divide example, the way I have seen vehicles used is very much because players wanted to venture out with each other in this vehicle as kind of a sort of driving, like a road trip sort of experience sometimes. There's a very lighthearted vibe behind it where it would kind of sometimes result in this like kind of adrenaline rush of like, as I said, like the dangerous waste, a sandworm just starts kind of chasing after the car, and then you have this like chase sequence of like having this really fun, high adrenaline sort of escape from the wilderness, effectively, to get back to home, back into the safety of the gates. And you don't get that. You don't get that. You don't get to facilitate that kind of experience when you just have the people running around. It's like this is the thing we're all in together because we're all in this vehicle, and without this vehicle, this lifeline, like we're fucked out here. Like this is our resilience against the wilderness and our ability to kind of engage with it. So very, very different interpretations of the same kind of idea and different ways to make it work versus potentially not working. Love that.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of like the I guess your at the end of the day your mechanic should be fun, or at the very least interesting. I know you have some of the art larps where they renounce having fun, but at the very least be at least a bit interesting, right? To participate in, rather than if you're I don't know. I guess we haven't had encouraging behaviors with boredom. I don't think I've not seen that go very well. Basically,
It tends to not go well.
Yeah.
Or we could all become turquoists. That is an idea.
I don't understand that one.
So that is basically the aforementioned style that someone's referring to, which is effectively like hardcore simulationism. You do everything the GM says, even if you're not having fun with the roleplay, it doesn't matter. Like your fun does not matter. What matters is the accuracy of the simulation of the experience.
That's not roleplay. That's historical reenactmentism.
I mean, it is a roleplay style. Is the thing. It's very extreme and is often like kind of spoken and
we
maybe even
poke fun at it a
ridicule.
little bit.
We kind of laugh about it quite a bit, but it's like it's there, it exists, it's around, you know. Historically, at least, like that was like 2-3 decades ago. It's a Scadian. I know that world. I see Carlon number 2. All right,
The
so
Cons are here.
I had one more thing before we move on.
Oh,
I
yeah.
just kind of like wanted to say like the day-night cycle. Speaking of which, first of all, thank you Waffle for saving me with the thing. In the development of Worlds Apart, I made a day-night cycle and it worked. And then we baked the map, and then we realized that Unity standard shader sucks.
Yep.
And I was like panicking, and then Waffle kind of like saved me with like the working version of what I had made. Basically, Unity standard shader sucks and does not function with ambient light once you bake it, which is
now.
really annoying. I think
For some reason, Unity turns off vertex lighting, ambient lighting, and one other thing that I ran into that I can't remember, if the lighting is baked. So anything static cannot react to ambient light, and it cannot react to non-important lights. It will only ever react to pixel lights.
I think I would be able to fix that nowadays. Like I know a bit more about shaders nowadays, but like that would require like rolling a custom shader and like.
That's what I did.
Yeah, well, at the time I was not yet knowledgeable about shaders, so well, now I would be able to fix it. But like, you know, naive me just assumed that ambient lighting would work, and of course it doesn't. You know, of course it doesn't. But yeah, I mean, of course I was not actually part of Worlds Apart, so I think like Solus's opinion is on this is probably more valuable as like kind of being in it. But I guess there is also kind of like the dev team perspective of like making these things, because like, man, making the skybox was really fun. Yeah. And like I suppose the reason the entire reason I made a really overkill skybox for Worlds Apart, we had a day-night cycle, but not only did we have a day-night cycle, but we had kind of like accurate seasons even, and like phases of the moons, plural, because there were 2 of them and one of them had rings. Yeah, so I put in like accurate seasons and phases of the moon, and the whole reason, the whole point of kind of making this ridiculous over-the-top skybox was for one thing. Worlds Apart had a lot about like free will and kind of like fate, and so I was asked at the very beginning of roleplay, can we have an eclipse on this map? And I was like, I think I can do it, and didn't quite get it the skybox out for the like the first day of the roleplay, but you know, it was finished thanks to Waffle by the 6th session, and yeah, and we kind of just like sat on the eclipse for a while, and then we started like teasing it, and you know, eventually it came just as predicted, which is really cool. I think so that was kind of like trying to be along one of those themes. And from like the game, from like the dev perspective here, right? Not necessarily the player perspective. I have to say, it was like an incredible joy to just like watch people like looking up at the sky for that entire session. Like that was an incredible joy.
And there is definitely something to be said about the reason why some of these mechanics get made in the first place. It's because we want to.
Yep, that's so true. But I wanted to speak on the player perspective to expand further on how it actually touched upon the themes. I think there was definitely a very clear note of escapism that evolved within the progression of Worlds Apart, because the setting was basically this consistent experience of civil war and its ramifications that would make a normal person kind of look for ways to get away from that and to mentally escape the division that is happening, and try to find something that's normal, some sort of cornerstone. And at some point, when I was kind of immersing myself in that mindset as Rowan, I kind of looked up at the sky and I'm like, that's the constant. Like, the sky will always be the same. And looking for the things in the sky, like the two moons, which were called the lovers. I forget exactly what their names were.
You say the sky will always be the same, but the constellations change.
Well, I mean, the sky will always be there. It won't.
Yeah,
the sky isn't a part of this war, right? The sky is up there. Obviously, it changes day to day, season to season, etc. Like, things are visible, things are not. But like, that consideration of what changes is already there. You already know that's going to happen. That's something you're already familiar with, and it's like that cornerstone of like this will always be there, right? The sky will always be there. That won't go away, and that tended to kind of ground my character when he was struggling with this notion of like, what's real anymore? Like, my world's kind of flipping on its head. I look up and suddenly I see something that I know. This is my constant. And that, to me, that's sort of like trying to look for a constant, that need to escape this vulnerable position of having the foundation ripped out from under you, for the most part, which I think a lot of characters would have tended to experience in a sort of Civil War scenario, was definitely definitely an evidence of that. I think like having the sky change very particularly helped that, because if it was just a static skybox, then you reference it the same way. If it changes, then you get to comment on it. You get to talk about it, which is why, sure, the scientific implications of the skybox and like looking up at the sky and looking for constellations and all is like fine and all, but like seeing whether the two moons are out or close to each other and commenting on that as like a little story creates a different way to talk about it and to escape the harsh reality of the setting, which I think made it 100 times better than if it were just static.
I will have to say, is also somewhat of a coincidence. When we planned it, I was like, we had originally planned the eclipse to be on session 17. Little did I know, because I was actually not paying attention to like IRL eclipses. There was an actual eclipse in real life like the next week.
Yeah.
Like an actual annular eclipse, and I was just like, huh. I did not plan this. That's really funny.
You made
Can
the
we
eclipse
flip it out
happen.
by an episode?
That was a wild week. I'll have you all know. That episode was crazy. That following week was pretty crazy. That was a time. That
I think
eclipse.
the oracles were arriving that day, wasn't it? Like,
yeah.
On the day of the eclipse. Like, yeah, we had a lot going on. It was just like very very stacked day.
That's
for sure.
Super heavy symbolism all around. Very, very good episode, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that out because we had touched on like day-night cycles,
Yeah.
And I guess my comments on day-night cycles is the same. I really like them. I really like them for kind of like the ability to, track the length of the role play even. But like that in
roleplay,
particular was a bit more.
like it works as a mechanic in so many different ways, both like tracking the length of the role play, uh, simulating the passage of time throughout a day to be like, oh, it's noon, the sun's overhead, I better have lunch. And also, like in missions, you'd be like a hard set timer, being like, all right, we have to get this done before sunrise, or else we'll get spotted because we're trying to be stealthy,
Hmm.
and so on and so forth. Also, Kurlon is right. We need to show you still in the hangout map we've had last night because it has a really
Oh,
interesting skybox on it.
Oh,
I
interesting.
see.
Yeah, we definitely.
I went to VCAT and somebody has like a not yeah, VCAT, and they had like an entire like planetarium in one of the booths,
Oh,
which is really cool.
I just like
Yeah,
the way that day night cycles can kind of prompt different kinds of roleplay too. Like if it gets dark, then you have these sort of more personal scenes, right?
yeah.
Whereas where it's daytime, you have more large groups and people venturing out more, and you can kind of plan around the different types of roleplay that people generally conduct in those times of day.
Yeah, and I think it has something to do with something similar to visual design. Like when it's daytime, if you have an open map, you can see quite a long ways. It is open, it is wide, it is breezy, and when the night falls, the darkness closes in the visual horizon a bit.
Yep.
It pulls the players together towards light sources
Hmm.
and campfires and all that fun stuff. It makes things more intimate and close and cozy, as it were. Like it's people running down for the day. There's very few things that happen at night unless you're specifically doing a thing, and it's basically, like the whole rallying against yellow paint or green lights in game design. It's basically the same thing. It's like it shows people where other people are by having them lit up because they're under lighting and everything else is dark.
Yeah. Also, just another note on like game design. We talked about how Blackwell uses night for like
Mm-hmm.
horror, right? Final Fantasy 15 does something pretty similar, where you have the kind of open expanse that you can drive around and have a good time adventuring with your royal retainer friends in your fancy car. But as soon as nighttime hits, the demons come out, and they're extremely strong and terrifying. And it's basically your note of you have to be seeking some sort of accommodations when it hits nighttime. You have to manage how you actually adventure around this place because nighttime is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
They evidence that pretty well, I think. The music, the visuals of it, they do a pretty good job. It's like, yeah, sure, you're probably safe going fast enough in your car, but if you get out of there's a vulnerability. It really sets in. The music just complements that really well.
This whole conversation is making me want to do a road trip role play where it's just like four people in a car and like things happen. It's
I swear we've like talked about that at some point, haven't we? I remember talking about it at some point. I don't remember who it was, but that was like road trip role play idea. I'm here for it. It's like do like a short form thing. I'd be down for that.
yeah.
All right. So, in the interest of time, we move onward. So,
Yeah, I was going to bring up something about some other role play type mechanic or type platforms, but I can hold off.
We've been, I guess, tiptoeing around the big ones.
yeah, and we could hold off on the other one for a bit, mostly because these ones are really big conversations too, and I feel like we've been
Yeah,
tangenting for quite a bit.
Yeah, if you have like one more thing, Waffle, like go ahead because I feel like there probably won't be an after. So
Yeah.
Okay, I'll rush through this point I had. I wanted to take a very quick look at other roleplay platforms and how their their mechanics are more for games rather than roleplay.
Mm.
And one of the main ones I want to look at is Dark RP from Gary's Mod. And that's a funny one, I'm sure, but if you know what Dark RP is, you're probably like, oh, that shit. But in Gary's Mod, there's a game mode called Dark RP, and it's basically a supposed roleplay game mode where you can go around and live in a town, and you can get a job, and you get some income, and you can do this other stuff. But the mechanics around it focus far too much on the game of it, and they start to miss out on the role part of it. So, like, in Dark RP, one of the things you can be is someone on the opposite side of the law. You know, you can be a gangster, you can be a drug dealer, all that fun stuff, because it's dark. Um, and what essentially happens is the people who play these just set up in a house somewhere and start grinding progression rather than actually role playing with anyone.
Right.
So they like buy a cash printer or buy some weed or whatever to grow and make money that way, and then they become a gun dealer and set up a shop somewhere. It stops being a role play and more transactional, as we were talking earlier. So that's my little homework for anyone watching. Go look into Dark RP and how that works with and against the fundamentals we have for VR chat roleplay.
I've definitely seen sort of similar interactions with GTA roleplay. In that I was watching someone introduce someone else into GTA roleplay, and the first thing they started talking about was how to make money, and talking about like different jobs you can do and different things to, like, mechanically get more money. And the only thing I could think was like, what is the purpose of getting more money in the context of the roleplay? Because I'm trying to like scope in like what exactly they do in the roleplay, and it generally seems like kind of wheeling and dealing in most cases. And I struggle to kind of understand where the grinding actually adds to the experience. But it really does feel like it's kind of on the similar vein of it is the thing that they do at around roleplay times rather than like facilitating something within it.
And I am probably going to get myself lynched here a little bit, but
Oh.
I will admit one of my guilty pleasures is watching a channel called Bub Games. He goes around basically trolling really bad roleplay servers.
Oh.
So like Dark RP or Harry Potter RP, and it's usually hilariously cringe. And one thing I've noticed is very fascinating in the more like Red Dead Redemption and Harry Potter role plays is that the mechanics lead to one power plays. So if you're in, you can get the power and then be better. But that's a different thing from what I was going for. The other thing is the term we use is made up of two root words here. It is role and play. And oftentimes in those, I feel like the mechanics and the communities surrounding them lead far more into the role. You have to be your role. You have to stick to the script. And you have to do this thing. And it misses the play. You have this very disruptive force of Bub Games coming in to cause havoc or whatever. And his last few videos, he's not even just RDMing or whatever. He's actually just like laughing at how bad things are while also just trying to do like silly roleplay on top of it. And they lose their shit. It goes horrendously wrong really fast, and everyone gets so mad when, if it's an open roleplay, it could be something very silly, like a side tangent, a little bit of a, take a break from the serious to have a little bit of fun, But they don't do that. Either their community or their mechanics are keeping them from just taking a step back, saying, all right, this is ridiculous. Let's just roll with it, have a little bit of fun, bullshit around for a bit, and then we can get back to the thing we do 9 hours a day every day. And it's fascinating and baffling at the same time to me.
I guess like I would even consider it kind of terrifying, because that sort of mentality can very quickly be othering, especially if you have that sort of openness where people, I guess, have to learn the ins and outs of a space like that. And understanding kind of what the goal is means that some people are going to miss out from time to time, even if they are kind of more invested in the space. That, like, if the mechanics are forcing people to kind of take it seriously enough that they are, like, really hounding people who don't, like, fit their expectation of how people will use those mechanics or how people engage within the roleplay, then it's like, man, there's got to be more to like onboard people. If they do it well enough and it does work, then it's like, thumbs up, more power to you. But if it is like there isn't enough really to help that, then it could be a bit alarming sometimes.
Yeah, and like in the last 2 videos I saw from him, one took place in Red Dead Redemption, the other took place in the Harry Potter roleplay. The Harry Potter roleplay was very odd because it spawned him in. He started acting like a student, and I guess an admin saw that he didn't go through the sorting hat ceremony, and teleported him out of the scene he was in, if you want to call it that. Just like use an admin command to vanish him from the people he was talking to, put him in the grand hall in front of the sorting hat, and told him, "Hey, interact with this mechanic. You must do this or you'll get kicked."
Oh God.
That is just.
You must be sorted, or else.
Yeah, you must do this. And
it's very wild way to go about it.
I'm not even sure what to make of something like that in the scale or the lens of Couchform. It just.
I guess I would need more context.
Fails.
But
well, in Harry Potter, you get sorted in the houses.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and that shows you where you're going.
I would just figure like how they use it. But we could talk about that some other time, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, if we were to put it through the lens of this game mechanics thing, getting pulled out of a scene to get sorted doesn't really do much to help the theme of the setting. It is part of the setting, but you're getting pulled out of what you're doing to go forcibly interact with this thing. It is the exact opposite of prompting roleplay, because you got pulled out of roleplay to do it. And it doesn't streamline or abstract away from anything, because you're getting pulled out of the roleplay to interact with this mechanic, or else you get kicked.
Yep. Pretty wild. Very wild, actually. I'm curious. I want to look up this stuff now. We can talk about that later, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So these are the big ones here. Common topics, things that tend to come up quite a bit in roleplay that we either use a lot or we talk about a lot. The first one that we have here: why did you change to it? Jesus Christ! All right, Waffle. All right. Okay, so I wanna. I'm not even gonna say it. I'm not even gonna say what the thing is, because now everyone knows. I was like looking for like an image for the background here, and Zillan just sends me like a giant D20, and I'm like, okay, I'm not ready for the abstract backgrounds yet. But apparently now we're here. All right, it's the D20. That's what we're talking about. The 20-sided dice that like so many players use to roll for. To insert randomness into some kind of outcome, or to help decisions, or to determine what happens, so to speak. It's the D&D esque sort of usage of the D20 dice. Let's talk about that.
I have some very strong opinions.
As do I.
I can lead here.
Okay.
In my opinion, dice in like a role play context, right? In a game, in like a game context, you can do a lot of things with dice, right? Like namely randomized stuff. In a role play context, dice and like other randomization options are good at evidencing one and only one theme, and that is the kind of the uncaring cruelty of the world, right? Randomness is really good at that. Random, things happening randomly is really good at creating something that is uncaring and, well, random. However, um, if you're going to do that, right? And actually, I won't. I'll go into the good first, right? I really love Ten Candles. Ten Candles is amazing. It's not a LARP. It's a tabletop game, but I think it has like possibly like one of the best uses of dice that I've ever seen. And the reason is because you're telling a tragedy, right? You're telling a story where all the characters die at the end. And the whole point, right? The whole point of Ten Candles is that the world is dying and it's cold and uncaring, and no matter what, your characters are going to die. No matter what. I think randomness and kind of like dice in general are very good at, being that, right? Being cold and uncaring. However, what I see a lot in a lot of role plays are people kind of like saying that, oh, a role play is deadly. You're going to have to like work to survive, and like and like anyone can die at any time, and it's like very fair because we're using these like systems and dice and whatever. Here's the problem. I feel like 99% of the time, like literally the vast majority of the time, people don't actually want a narrative. Even in sort of like a survival situation, most of the time I feel like people don't actually want a narrative that is cold and uncaring and not satisfying, right? That's like a very like specific type of tragedy, where having just like an unsatisfying end to your narrative is like a very specific type of tragedy that I personally love, but I think it's not very popular. And most of the time, when people are kind of doing survival role plays, they're going into it expecting a sort of like a heroic narrative, right? Where it's like the setting has like scarcity and survival, but the vast majority of the time, there's like a heroic narrative that's expected. And when the dice inevitably don't deliver on the heroic narrative, and you instead end up with something incredibly not satisfying, it's up to the GMs to essentially lie to their players to turn the cold and uncaring narrative that's being dictated by the dice into something that's exciting and heroic. And so that is kind of like my opinion on dice, is that they are really good at one specific thing, and it's just not being used that way. And GMs are putting extra work on themselves to like compensate for the fact that the dice are doing exactly the opposite of what their players want.
All right.
Anyway, that's my rant. There you go. It's my thoughts.
I wanna do my rant. I wanna get the soapbox is right next to me here. I'm gonna get it, place it down, stand on it. Okay. Full agreement that 99% of the time, the way the dice are used is not in support of the exact theme that dice are really good at doing, which is, again, uncaring reality of the world. It doesn't work in the way that you expect it to. It is out of your control, right? And it can happen in very random ways. That randomness, uncaring nature of the world, etc. The way that dice are often used, and this is what I want to like make the strongest commentary on, is that they are used to make decisions for you. So in the player perspective, the player might roll that d20 to see if their character makes a certain decision on something. What do I go left or right in this fork in the road? I'm rolling evens one way, odds the other. What that does, if we're looking at the mechanical or looking at the criteria of the roleplay mechanic definition, immediately takes out prompt roleplay. Because not only is it actually pausing other people from interacting with the person at this time, which immediately takes away time from the roleplay itself, which happens every single time you roll a dice. You are removing roleplay opportunity. It is also taking roleplay from yourself for not actually interacting with the decision that is being made. If you have that dice and you make that decision based on the dice, then it's not because your character did it. It's because the dice said so. It is because the thing that is different, indifferent, and uncaring has made the decision for you, for your character, and so that means that your character effectively didn't make the decision. And characters making decisions is character development. That is character progression. That is exactly the thing that people look for. So it is also taking that away from them. If it doesn't evidence the usual theme of randomness and an uncaring reality, it's not evidencing any theme otherwise. And honestly, I don't know what it's abstracting away from, because it actually adds. It's only adding more space. It's not additive to the experience. It's just adding more space. So like, I would posit that the usual case for the player using it just fails all three. Right? It's wild how much it fails. Why is there a Patrick whenever? Oh my god. Anyways, Jesus Christ. So from the GM perspective, this is kind of the other very common case where something happens and you have to roll to determine what happens from it. This is the outcome perspective. This is once again, I would once again make the case that this is harmful to the scene because one of the major things that Scylla mentioned that is absolutely one of my strongest points against using the D20 in that circumstance is the unsatisfactory outcome, which is pretty much anything that's not interesting. And the dice, what it basically does is if you add it into a situation, then you are giving the opportunity for the scene to go any sort of direction, regardless of what you think, right? So you could, for example, have a situation in which something could be realized about the scene that could make it interesting and make characters react differently to certain pieces of the scene. Like, for example, this is an example that I mentioned before. In Fractured Thrones, there was a scene where my character, who owned a forge, came back to the forge to another character who works for my character. So Flynn was my character, Quintus was Soda Soaps. He was basically doing dirty dealings with one of the GM characters. I think his name was the Viper. I forget. And I heard this from the outside. I decided I'm going to come back around, give him some time to figure out that scene, and then I come back, make my rounds. I figure it's about time I come back in. So I come in, have a conversation with Quintus, and it's like, okay, we've had this conversation, nothing happened. I walk out. So I was like, this was otherwise a very uneventful scene. And I look back to see what happened after that, just to like figure out what made it uneventful, because I knew there was something that could have happened there. Like there could have been some development of like, Flynn finds out that Quintus is doing some weird sus shit inside the forge, and it's like, what's going on here? Why are you using my forge for this? What's wrong with you? Right? Could have created that drama. Why it didn't happen was because Brunswick rolled 2 dice that were a 5 or less, said that's too bad, and then flied away. Like, that's what happened. The dice being entered into that situation, which otherwise could not be, basically removed that situation from even happening to begin with, which made it very uninteresting and very unsatisfying. Which, to me, I'm thinking, if the dice weren't there, then that would be a narrative decision which could be accountable. Which brings me to my next point. Adding dice makes the outcome unaccountable to anyone because the dice decided. So the narrative decision making is taken away from the players and from the GMs and anyone else interacting with the narrative because the dice is the one deciding for them. Which then brings us to Patrick booing the dice because that's just awful, right? That's just like,
Yeah.
you should absolutely be accountable for your narrative decisions to begin with. But on top of that, like, if there is something interesting that can happen within a scene that can elevate it and create interesting opportunities and interactions between characters, then like why not do it? I just don't see the understanding or the reason to add randomness in a situation that could otherwise be more fun.
Yeah, the
I
dice do not understand what is and isn't narratively appropriate because they are not sentient. So
I suppose there's been 2 rants so far, so I suppose it's my turn.
go ahead.
Let's go.
So there's been several times where I was a player and the dice were forced upon me. And they were not asked for. They were just something a DM decided to do. And it detracted from the scene that I was in. One of them happened in Aether Chronicles. I completely blanked the name for a second there. And it was simple. It was silly. And it was basically, I was the Luli, running around my little sprite character. And my entire basic narrative in that roleplay, because I couldn't really get anything else done, and that's a different issue, but was that they were always hungry and always looking for new food experiences. And I don't remember if this was a DM or the character themselves at this point, because this happened like a year and a half ago or more. But someone came over. Their character was an element of blight or whatever, and someone rolled, and suddenly my food was spoiled. I was like, okay, cool, that's awesome. That had very little to do with me, but now I have to reap the consequences of it. And that didn't feel too great. The other time was in ATK. I was having a conversation with another character, and it was kind of humorously combative. Basically kind of a rival play kind of thing. And so we're going back and forth on this topic, and a DM just appears behind me and says, with a 2, you feel utterly intimidated by this character. It's like, why are you rolling for my disposition? This is my character. Let me play it. And those are hugely negative experiences that I have kept in mind to this day, because it is not only when the dice are forced upon you without asking, it is also when the dice are forced upon you by mechanic. Why would I want a 5% chance that my hugely trained character, my character who's gone through years of practice, who's been doing this for decades, suddenly looks like an inept moron at a 5% chance?
Right.
Because the dice said 1. What is the point of that? What does that add? All it does is act as character assassination.
Yeah.
It makes my character look inept to no benefit, and it doesn't further the roleplay. And that is what dice do.
I have... Go on.
You know who knows if you want that? You know, you the player do, right? Yeah. You the player know if you want your big strong character to look who's trained to look inept, right? The dice don't know that. Dice have absolutely no idea, but you do.
Yeah.
I had a funny exact opposite experience, but I do want to comment first on your experiences with the dice forced, because the way I see it, the dice actually weren't the problem. They create their own problem, but the main problem is the narrative decisions made by someone forcing those situations upon you, the player, right? Because like if the dice weren't involved, then you would still have the same issues with it, because like the person pushing the blight onto the food that your character would have otherwise really craved and had in that moment seems like it's not really doing much besides inconveniencing them to go find some more food.
Yeah.
At least in the moment. Or the narrative decision to say that your character feels a certain way about another character while it's completely outside the scope of the scene, and also narrating another character's feelings is generally just bad, right? Unless it's something you've effectively consented to, or it's what the role play is about, or whatever have you. Like just doing it out of the blue is obviously not good form. But what I will say is I had the exact opposite interaction with the dice, telling me that my character was far more skilled than I expected him to be. Because once again, going back to Fractured Thrones, Flynn, there was a festival. We had a festival while a bunch of characters were out on a mission. So all the strong characters, for the most part, were out, but there were still some strong characters left. So I was like going into this like, okay, my character is kind of like, it seems like a fun thing to do. So he's gonna come into these games, and there's like a log lift, and he's gonna do this. It's gonna be fun. Uh, and like he's like, I'm not expecting to win. Whatever. He's not very strong. He's just a dude that crafts metal stuff, small trinkets, and all that. And he's not combative. He's completely non-combative. He's one of two non-combative characters, which we're generally not able to do much in the roleplay. But anyways, when it came down to it, everything in this festival competition was rolled for, including this log lift. And it was a single flat roll that everyone went through. And Flynn got a natural 20 for his lift. So he ended up doing it. And he ended up being the only one to successfully do it, which meant he won a strength competition, which was like, he became known as the strongest man in Adwick. And I was like, what the fuck is happening here? Like this is odd. It didn't carry at all because like no one cared. Neither did I. I kind of brought it up later on as like a bragging point as the character because he would do that. But it was like this doesn't really make sense at all. Like why would this match at all what's actually supposed to happen here? And it's like, yeah, sure, you get the unexpected things. It's whatever. But it's narratively weird when you have this guy win the contest of strength. But it happened because the dice have a funny top and bottom number that if you roll the top one, you just kind of succeed critically at the thing, usually. You get the best case scenario. And if you roll the bottom one, you get the worst case scenario, which usually means failure, even if you're really good at the thing. So you get that funny 5% on both sides.
I would say that the Nat 20 is almost a bigger problem for me than the Nat 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because a Nat 1 represents the ever-present existence of the chance of failure.
Yeah.
Anything you do, there's always a chance that you will screw it up somehow. The Nat 20 is the most abused feature of the dice, in my opinion, because it allows you to do the impossible. A lot of DMs let you get away with that for some reason. So at a 5% chance, suddenly you can shoot an arrow 500 yards, or you can lift a log 20 times your size and well out your strength class because the funny double-digit number came up.
Yeah.
And that makes no sense to me.
And I mean, like, the big question that then comes up is, when do you roll? Because when you roll, basically opens up that possibility for those things. Like if you are confronted with a situation where the impossible is present, but is made possible by the dice being entered into a situation, then suddenly you now have a possible scenario. You've effectively changed the scenario by adding a dice to it. Likewise, if you have a scenario where the thing is very possible, doable, and frankly you wouldn't fail it and you introduce a dice in, then you potentially introduce failure into a scenario that it would not be fit for. And on top of all of that, the chance for something to be less satisfying is almost always the case when you throw a dice into something. Yeah. So the question of when do you roll is something that has to be asked whenever you are using dice in a narrative sense. And usually that question is almost impossible to answer. And I find that it often leans in the direction of like we have very specifically structuralized where the dice are being used. But I would then ask, then why are you using the dice? Because then it seems like you are basically just bogging down the roleplay because you know exactly what the dice are being used for, and in a sense, you can define a better system for them.
I can tell you, like, having GM'd just a little bit, I can tell you this is not how I think anybody else uses the dice, but I can tell you how I use the dice in Worlds Apart. Probably very very differently than most GMs in the space.
Mm.
So yeah, first of all, I did kind of like want to bring the conversation back a little bit. You have already touched on it, Solace, a bit about like responsibility, and I think like this is like kind of like the big factor for me in terms of like using dice is, to me it feels like the reason that we have dice is it's kind of like a holdover from, well, a D&D. D&D as a game has rules. And the thing is with kind of games is games generally have rules to kind of like establish kind of well, specifically to establish trust between the players, right? Like the rules of a game are essentially forming the magic circle. The difference between rules, like and in this context, like hard rules where it's like you must do this, you must do that, versus like the social agreement, right? Like the implicit social agreement of the magic circle is that rules are often used as a substitute for trust. And this is really how a lot of the usage of the d20 and of dice feels to me. Feels like a substitute for trust. I've seen, thankfully, not so much. I mean, I know it still exists, just in the spaces that I am in, I don't see it as much anymore. But I definitely, when I first joined the roleplay community, I did see a lot of essentially players not trusting each other to follow the rules. And so you had like a big push for kind of like rolling transparently, right? And you're using the dice because players don't trust each other to follow the rules. Um, so you so players then kind of like outsource the decision making to GMs, right? But then GMs are playing kind of the kind of like an optics game and don't want to make unpopular decisions. So you outsource the decision making to dice, right? Kind of like players outsource their decision making to GMs, and GMs outsource their decision making to dice. That's really what it's felt like to me. Like one of like I think the big reasons that dice are used is not so much for not so much for what they're doing mechanically, but as a substitute for trusting each other. Which, I mean, you know, trust is, you know, very important in playing a game. So I suppose if having dice in your roleplay allows the people in it to trust each other, then I suppose it is at least accomplishing something. But I would still say that I think dice are a very bad way to to do that. I would still say that. That being said, the way that I use dice in Worlds Apart, kind of like the way that I saw dice while GMing, is it was kind of like a tool. As a GM, I found myself. I suppose I dug my own grave by making the GM menu and having like the ping system, and kind of like taking that from Neon Divide. We were kind of being pulled in lots of different directions, and as like an invisible floating GM, it's kind of really hard to assess a scene when you're first jumping into it. It's really hard to kind of get a grasp of what's going on when you're quickly when you're being called for, and you have to do it quickly because otherwise you're holding up the roleplay. And making decisions like that on the fly really difficult. And so I kind of like conceptualize dice as like a tool to help GMs make decisions when you're kind of overloaded. Now, when I was GMing, I didn't really use the dice all that often, and not rolling dice and instead making my own decisions kind of made me realize two things. First, the fact that as a floating GM, as somebody who's like invisible and like floating around, you really have no idea what the heck is going on in a scene like most of the time. Like when you first arrive to a scene as a GM, you have absolutely no idea what's going on. And honestly, like unless you've been watching the scene unfold for a while, you're probably actually not going to make a significantly better decision than rolling randomly, right? Like that's my opinion there. Like the GM who just jumped into the scene 10 seconds ago is probably not going to make a significantly better decision about what to do or what's narratively appropriate than rolling randomly. But kind of like the second thing was that in those like few cases that I did actually end up rolling, it was kind of like one of those things, where you like flip a coin and like while the coin is in the air, you kind of know what it is that you want, actually. And I kind of that's basically how I ended up rolling was like I just rolled the dice and like while the dice was rolling, I kind of like used that motion and that time to kind of like figure out what the decision would be. Um, that is basically the extent of how I use dice. I did not use it to make any decisions in the entirety of Worlds Apart at all. Whew. Anyway,
I will say, and if anyone from ATK is here, they're probably gonna bonk me with a brick after this. But I did the same exact shit with the sim pods in the gym. Whenever I was DMing that, I basically just rolled, got a basic idea of where the players were in my head and what they were trying to do, and narrated what they were doing from there.
I think I will kind of close out my own ideas with like two concessions that I have about the D20. One is basically what Selden said, is that there is a way to there is a good theme that the D20 tends to target, and that playing into that with the dice and refusing to go any further is generally a good practice. So taking it away from like sort of the narrative decision role that it is tended to take, because currently it is very often used as a game mechanic and not as a roleplay mechanic, and it can be used as a roleplay mechanic if you do it properly. But the second thing is that what it can be helpful for is a kind of introductory helper for decision making for people that are having difficulty doing so, especially for people that are new to roleplay. Making decisions as characters that make impact is very difficult. I know it was very difficult for me starting out until I got the hang of things, and doing so in a way that ramps up. With the D20 as a helper for that can be good, with the understanding that it is a crutch and that it does have to be phased out at some point, right? Like at some point you learn kind of what a character might decide upon, what they actually want out of a situation, and how to make that more narratively interesting at some points. Then you can just do away with the D20 and then just go on with your usual ways. Those are like the only two like very big concessions that I would make for the D20. Besides it, I am so anti dice. I am very.
Before we move on, can I speedrun Just a Little Lovin'? That LARP?
Sure.
I think that's another. Actually doesn't use dice, but randomization mechanic. I'm going to lump all randomization mechanics together here. Just a Little Lovin', it was a very influential LARP. I forget when it was run. Obviously, haven't played it. It was long time ago at this point. Very influential LARP about the kind of the AIDS epidemic. And the way that the LARP would run is it would alternate between two types of scenes. So first you would have characters kind of like at a party and kind of like hanging out with each other. And then like in between these scenes of like characters like being with each other, both socially but also sexually, um, in between those scenes, they had kind of like a very abstract scene where the GMs would come in, and the GMs would be essentially death, and they would kind of like collect people's names in a hat. Um, People would kind of like willingly put names into this hat based on like how at risk they thought they were. And then they would draw these names from the hat, and whoever's names were drawn, their character is just dead. This is probably like the equivalent of a death roll in VR chat, except they weren't using dice; they were using a hat, right? Like same difference, right? I've seen voluntary death rolls done with dice too.
I suppose
the thing is,
okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the main difference in that is that when you use a hat, unless you're seeding it with a bunch of blank notes, someone will be drawn from the hat. Whereas dice, there is always the potential that nobody gets drawn, as it were.
It's true. It's still like they could have done it with dice, right? Like you probably could have had a very similar roleplay with dice, randomization mechanic. What I think the main difference was, though, right, is that the point of this LARP, right, the whole point of having a LARP about the AIDS epidemic is that it's really unfair and it sucks and it's awful. Surviving is not heroic. Having a character just like end sucks, and that's the point, right? And that's where I think like a lot of like randomization mechanics fail, is like you will inevitably have these narratives that just get cut short and come to a premature end unless you like massage the randomization to a point where you're essentially lying to your players. That will always happen. And yeah, I mean, if you don't want that, then I would recommend probably don't use dice, or maybe, you know, I don't know, do something like Mutants and Masterminds, where they have like hero points where you can just choose to succeed because you're being heroic or something, right? That's kind of like yeah. So if you don't want narratively dissatisfying moments to be in your roleplay, then I would recommend avoiding randomization.
Just don't roll the dice.
Yep.
Just don't do it.
Don't allow it to happen.
Yep. All right.
It kind of makes me. I've been kind of wanting to help Ava out with her badass endeavors idea because of that, honestly, where everything's decided by the rule of cool rather than dice rolls.
Yeah.
Like whoever does the coolest thing gets the roll or gets the thing.
Yeah, that enters some other considerations, but it's certainly like not random, which is good. There's some determination that isn't just randomness, right? All right, next big one.
Before I'm going to stand up and get some water. I ran out about a half hour ago.
Oh yeah, please. I'm going to take a sip here too, actually, before we manifest on edges and flaws. So I want to start this one.
Go for it then.
Okay, edges and flaws. I don't know if Waffle has an image to change to for this, but the floating ominous D20 is still scaring me. So Waffle's gone getting water, so that's good and all. Edges and flaws. Jesus Christ. This we avoided talking about a little bit a couple other times because this is also one that I know Selen and I are very passionate about, and I'm actually sure Waffle is as well. And the reason why is because edges and flaws are very good at making characters feel special, right? That we talked about in the scope of normalcy can lead to some very interesting situations detracting from normalcy, but the design of it is that edges and flaws are made to create this sort of specialization, this sort of like specific focus of like being exceptionally good at a very particular thing. And what that tends to do is
Exceptional characters, I think, not necessarily just exceptional good, just exceptional period.
right. Right. And what tends to happen, welcome back. So what tends to happen with this is not only does this pull characters away from each other in the sense of like everyone trying to kind of open their wings, or whatever the term is, like they're basically peacocking, right? It very often leans toward the heavily mechanical side. Usually when I've seen like edges and flaws kind of pushed into a system, it was to interact with the system in very specific ways. Neon Divide's actually a very big offender of this notion, in that edges and flaws had like types where it was like either you had a weakness to a particular element or damage type, or you could do some particular feats, or you were physically slower or less able to jump, and those were all like embedded into the map in some capacity. So like there was a very strong incentive to just make your edges and flaws that, instead of being about how the character interacts with the characters, which then kind of took away from the characters actually interacting with each other, which very much fails the prompt roleplay bit. There's not really any abstraction happening, because you are effectively listing out and putting into reality the exact exceptionalities of the character. And basically they only really fit if you are evidencing this sort of exceptionality that actually makes sense within the themes of your roleplay. If you are running a sort of heroic roleplay, then it actually makes sense to do something like that, because generally you want to be able to explore how those characters end up being heroic and what kind of exceptional qualities either make them heroic or flawed in again, exceptional ways. But generally this tends to get inserted into the standard creation process of characters, where there's not necessarily an expectation of exceptionality from a character, but because these edges and flaws exist, because a system exists that your character has to be exceptional in some way, then they become exceptional, and that means you have a bunch of exceptional things within a roleplay that's otherwise pretty normal. And as Syndrome said, and I this keeps coming up, whenever one's special, no one's special, right? And that basically drives the edges and flaws system into the ground, because again, if everyone kind of shares this exact dynamic, albeit in different ways, and what you're doing is effectively pulling characters apart from each other and not giving them more to share. And generally, if you do want players to play with a common base to share the themes of the roleplay, you're going to want them to be stronger on what they share rather than how they don't share with each other. And that, I think, kind of potentially lends to why a lot of character creation happens in a vacuum, is because there are these systems that kind of incentivize that, right? So there's my manifesting on the system.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed in the edges and flaws paradigm is that it's always used in a mechanical sense. It is always, this is my +3 to this roll, and this is my -3 to this event. It is never used as a way to personalize your character. It is always used as, this is my power, not this is how my character reacts to situations. Like as a character design tool, edges and flaws is really powerful. Like if you used edges to define where your character excels, like if they are cool under pressure, where they don't panic easily, or they are a natural born leader where they'll take charge of situations, and their flaws are not like I as a if I roll once a day I get I don't know fatigued or whatever. It instead it could be like the exact opposite of what I just said. Like they could be like averse to leadership or whatever. They'll rebel against any or rebel and rebuke any sort of orders and do their own thing as much as I can, or things like that. Um, in D&D, which I know VR chat roleplayers love to pull from, they the later systems have I think this is D&D. I might be confusing with Pathfinder, but they have instead of edges and flaws, they have ideals, bonds, and flaws. So like ideals are where your character, um, what they believe in. Like, do they believe in bettering the world? Do they believe in gaining knowledge? So on and so forth. Bonds are more like what is tying them to the scene, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I played D&D. And flaws, of course, are much like what I was just saying with the flaws system with edges and flaws, but it's more narrative. It helps you define who you are rather than what toys you have to play with.
So I want to I want to kind of like add on to what you just said there, because I think I have an answer for you of why it is never used as a character creation tool. And I think that the reason edges and flaws are used the way that they are in VR chat roleplay, in one sentence, this is silent hot take time. I think the system of edges and flaws is systemic min-maxing. Here's why.
That makes sense.
Here's why. You might ask, why is it edges and flaws? Why is it never edges? Why is it never just flaws? The reason is the kind of discussion around edges and flaws in character creation almost inevitably, like it is inseparable from balance. The idea of having edges and flaws together is, well, your character has an advantage, and to counterbalance that advantage, you have a flaw, to be fair. And that's the word that's usually used, is that it's fair. In order to have an advantage, you have to have a disadvantage to counterbalance that. I vehemently disagree with this idea. Like you may have thought I don't like D20s. I think D20s still have their uses. I vehemently dislike this idea of like fairness here in roleplay. And the reason being, this line of thinking of like, okay, if my character has an advantage, they need a disadvantage to counterbalance it, and then vice versa, is literally the definition of min-maxing. Min-maxing comes from like other role-playing games, namely tabletop games in which you're like creating a character, and min-maxing is the act of minimizing the stats that you don't care about in order to maximize the stats that you do care about. That is what min-maxing is. And that is what edges and flaws are. I suppose you don't have to use the system in that way, but that is what it is encouraging you to do. You are being explicitly encouraged to give your character negatives that you don't care about, and give yourself advantages that you do care about. And that is min-maxing. Now, as somebody who doesn't like to min-max, I find it actually impossible to create a character within the edges and flaws system. I have literally I've literally like skipped role plays over this because I just like can't create a character in that way. But I suppose that aside, it really is just systemic min-maxing. There's absolutely nothing stopping somebody from describing their character's strengths and their character's weaknesses in a short summary or in a backstory. The reason they're lumped together in this way, the reason they're put together in this way is because of some like idea that it's more fair that way, which I entirely reject because min-maxing is explicitly a form of power gaming, which is explicitly, playing to win, which is kind of the opposite of the reason why I roleplay. Anyway, that's it.
I would like to reference a conversation we had earlier, Sylvan, in which the very, very often thing that happens with flaws is that players will tend to try to justify the flaws in some way, shape, or form. It's effectively like to win this sort of this sort of trust with the system by saying, "Oh, it's okay because this character actually has this flaw," which is totally fine.
It's okay that I have this superpower. It's balanced because I also have this flaw.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And on top
They're
of that,
basically treating it like Project Zomboid's trait system rather than a role play.
And like on top of
in my
that,
perspective, right? In my perspective, if you want to play a powerful character, you should play a powerful character. If you want to play a character that has interesting flaws that you want to explore, you should just have those interesting flaws that you want to explore. The moment you bring like balance into the equation, right? The moment you start thinking about, oh, you need an edge and a flaw together to balance each other out, it just turns into min-maxing.
Yeah. And of course, you also get the situations where someone puts a flaw in their thing that tries to turn itself into an edge.
Yep.
Which is always fun.
That's exactly what I was getting into. One of two things. One being flaws can be avoided. So, like, if your character has the aversion to heat, you just don't go to a hot place and suddenly you don't experience a flaw and you just limit your own roleplay. Like, why? How is that fun? Right? You're giving yourself less roleplay for, like, no benefit at all. Like, it just feels awful, honestly. And then on top of that, like you said, there are people I have seen someone use a flaw where if they get hit in the head, they go berserk. And I've seen them have that flaw and then specifically open up their head for a strike in a fight to win it. Like, what? that's all right. It's not a flaw anymore. It's not, because the player effectively just broke their character for like something they wouldn't normally do by just saying, "Oop, I'm just gonna do the thing. Oh no, oops, my head got hit. Guess I'm gonna go flail wildly and win this somehow." And again, it makes it not a flaw because at that point you have effectively used it as an advantage. And it was a major flaw, by the way. So this is like this was just wildly turning an its head to there goes all the trust in the system.
Yeah, like that was something I was about to bring up as well. Like that sort of thing, the system itself harms trust because you're trying to game the system rather than make an interesting character. And everyone's trying to do this, so everyone tries to do this.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle.
So it kind of does, but it also kind of doesn't. That is what I was going to bring up is kind of like this idea of responsibility, as well. It's kind of like toxic in the same way that like replacing trust with dice is toxic. Like it works to an extent, right? Like it is also a form of social contract where like it's okay, guys, my character is balanced, I have a flaw, right? You're essentially like systematizing it in this way gives people a way to kind of like broadcast to other people that here I'm playing by the rules. Now here's the problem. Here's the problem. It is once again another way to shake responsibility off onto the system. Instead of I'm playing a powerful character, I have to do that carefully, right? Because playing a powerful character, that's a lot of responsibility on me. Instead, I am playing a powerful character. I am allowed to do it. I have no responsibility.
Right. It's because there's a rule that dictates that it's okay for me to do the thing that I'm doing.
This is okay.
Then I'm passing that rule, so it's okay.
Yeah. So it is. So that's really like where I think the issue is people tend to use this as well as like a means to kind of establish trust, where it's like, hey guys, my character is balanced here, I can show you. But what actually ends up happening is really easily abusable in that way of like, well, you can still just like have something slip through the cracks, and then now it's a rule that you are allowed to have no responsibility for your actions and decisions. And
Just the
I
shrug
think
of,
that
well, the mechanics let me do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Shrug, the
and
dice
ends
let
up
me
being
do it.
toxic.
Shrug, the mechanics let me do it. Shrug, it's my edge. Just my character is what they would do. Yeah, roleplay, not rule play is the what was that?
My arm is possessed by a mighty demon. It'll corrupt me and take my soul. But it also makes me very powerful, very handy for the duration of this roleplay.
Yeah, but it's my flaw, so
yeah,
I can have it with the other edges. See, this is...
I'm going to die one day after this. My character is going to die one day after this. The conclusion of this roleplay. It's my flaw.
Oh no! All right. So yeah, to conclude here, that this is a system that incentivizes min maxing and like should absolutely either not be used or be used with a lot of care in a very specific manner that incentivizes people to be exceptional. Like I could see it work in the badass endeavors, right? Potentially, but like since it does work with rule of cool, I would say potentially not, right? This is part of those considerations that we would make.
I will go. This is like the one time where I will be like even more forceful in my opinion. I don't even think it incentivizes min maxing. I think it just literally is min maxing. Like that is actually
That's
what
fair.
it is. Like inherently.
Yeah, I will reiterate what I said at the beginning of the section. Edges and flaws, very good for defining your character. In fact, 10 Candles has this built in, the Vice and Virtue cards. Except that has the fun little quirk of you write down a Vice and Virtue, and then you pass it to the left and the right. So you get somebody else's ideas.
Right.
That's fun.
It also has the fun little quirk of forcing you to play into them.
Yeah.
True.
Which is, I suppose, the whole point, that's kind of the whole point of having a flaw is to play into it.
Yeah. They are not mechanical, they are descriptive. That is where that sort of system thrives. When it's just +3 to this and -3 to that, it's not so handy. It's boring.
Agreed. All right. In the interest of time, let's move on to the last one. And this one is I actually find this one really interesting. I think we'll get a lot of different ideas out of this. Thinking of like mechanical systems and specifically systems that decide things using some sort of quantifiable data tend to be very hard to use in roleplay because we are normally focusing on character interactions, how characters interact with each other in the world, and numbers usually don't really care about that. They don't know about that. However, VR does kind of enter some of this into consideration quite a bit because where normally our role-playing games tend to not have that programmatic freedom, and while IRL very much doesn't have this sort of programmatic freedom because it's literally real life, VR, I feel VR LARP is the unique kind of middle ground of this where we do have that freedom. We do have the ability to program these sort of unique interactions. And it's also in real time. So we also have the responsibility to consider how these are interacted with in a very real time perspective. So this notion of like having back-end systems that don't necessarily that may or may not present to the player can actually influence a scenario in a very interesting and unique way. I actually want to reference Blackwell once again
Mm-hmm.
for this one with the statues, right? If
Mm.
you have the programmatic calculation of whether or not you're looking at a statue, and when you look away, it moves, and you look back, it stops. That's all like being calculated on the back end, right? You're not seeing the numbers that is measuring the angle of where you're looking and where the statue is and the mesh renderer there or any sort of movements that it's making, how fast it's going. You don't see any of that. But if you have control over all of this, and if you are making the world, generally you do, then you can program this sort of experience into the roleplay, and that little interaction, that little element, kind of heightens a bit of the experience because it's something unique that still fits within the theme. It's still, you don't see what's happening because it's specifically you not seeing what's happening, and that's specifically the subject of the element, right? It is interesting. It's different. It's something that wouldn't otherwise happen. Like, how could you do this in IRL LARP? It's you couldn't do that. How could you do this in any other medium? It's usually not real time. You're not fully immersed into a headset if you're in like a kind of sandbox game role playing. It's such a unique thing that I love having this conversation. So I'll like kind of open it up like very broadly, like what your thoughts are on that sort of freedom and like what's actually possible with VR and what your thoughts are on how it could kind of be explored further. Just as like a broad form. Either of you two.
Well, this is kind of what my mind is always doing, is always ruminating on this, so I could go off on this topic. So I'm gonna hold off for Scylla to go first.
Fair enough.
But she's muted.
Oh no.
Oh no.
I figure you
All
could
right, maybe
probably
we'll go.
you could probably go ahead first.
All right. So, on the whole mechanical automation, I guess you could call it. When I started role playing in VRC, is when SDK 3 had just come out. We were working on a map in SDK 2, then SDK 3 drops with Udon, and we're like, we can do a lot now that we can actually script things. So we did. Unfortunately, that map never really saw the light of day, but it also served as a testing ground for a lot of the features you saw in 8K and Blackwell. This was Stiletto RP, and it used to be a text roleplay, and it was supposed to be a VRC roleplay, but interest just faded before we got there. The addition of Udon catapulted forward VRChat roleplay's potential by light years, I want to say. SDK2's trigger system was neat. You could set up standard Unity things. If you could put them behind a trigger, it would work. But being able to do logical progressions and logic chains and all that fun stuff, like if this, then this, else this, is very powerful compared to if you walk into a trigger, something happens. Or if you click a button, something happens. Like, menu systems would be incredibly difficult under Udon, or without Udon, under SDK2's trigger system. You could probably do that with a bunch of constraint and triggers and whatnot, but without Udon, it becomes horrendous. So it added this whole game design element to VRChat roleplay that is so very powerful. And I was really confused about why things like AA weren't using this for the longest time. They were still stuck on SDK2 because their map needed to be adjusted to it because the triggers all went away. But it was fascinating. And you can do a lot. Like, if you look back at what I've done for ATK, some of the scenes that I was able to set up with the team's help, like, for instance, episode 13. If you don't know what episode 13 is in ATK, it is when Darling died.
Spoiler alert.
This was the main event of episode 13 was a mainline power bus malfunction where several events happened in very short succession to cause a roleplay wide event. Now, we could have set this up as just a singular animation and then had the DMs run around the place and do all the DM things in every single location on the ship where this is all happening. But what I did for it is that I took Ezrai's damage object system and his fire extinguishers, and I coupled them into this system for the event, where an auxiliary power bus was overloaded, and 3 separate explosions happened and lit off both arc flashes and fires. So the initial trigger that could have been an animation, easy enough. But Udon, incorporating an Udon system in it, allowed me to take the workload, this huge potential workload, off the shoulders of the DMs and automate it. So the system starts the event runs as players deal with things, and as the players slowly figure out how to cut the power to these arc flashes, and that was continually relighting these fires. That was like the main thing that DMs had to deal with, was just like when the players actually were able to figure out how to do this. And then the fires themselves were able to be put out just by the automated fire extinguisher stuff. So systematically, that episode was 70% automated. And that is one of the main powers of Udon and scripting and roleplays.
Right. Like the big takeaway there being like you have so much control over how things, if you are setting up for particular major events, how they pan out and what kind of conditions require them to continue. Right. Like triggers can resolve that, but that's like still, I think, within the same discussion of like, we have the technical medium, how do we use it, and facilitating the timing of certain events and or the reaction of certain things based on how players interact with it is like largely immensely powerful. I see Selena's unmuted. I don't know if she's ready to chime in.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I have, I suppose, a bit of like an abstract answer to this question. In the sort of like, I think I've talked, I don't know if I've talked about it on this podcast, but I've talked about like, VR roleplay, like the advantage of VR roleplay as a medium. I think I've talked about that.
Yeah.
And like what I think are the main advantages of VR roleplay is specifically accessibility and embodiment. Those were like the 2 things that I think VR roleplay does better than, well, other forms of roleplay. In that same like spirit, VR is VR, but we're also on we're also essentially playing a computer game in VR chat. And in that same spirit, the things that computers are good at, that other forms, like kind of like other things aren't as good at, are number 1, hidden information, number 2, random number generation or pseudo-random number generation, and number 3, doing lots of things really quickly. That's essentially what kind of like, and I'll say games in this context, right? That's exactly that is what a game can leverage if you're running that game on the computer. In this context, the game is VR chat. And if yeah, I suppose if your role play needs to leverage like any one of those things, then that's really what we're getting out of, well, being on a computer. We can you can play with hidden information, which historically in like a more traditional setting is kind of difficult. You kind of really hidden information in like larps or like in other games is usually done through cards. Cards are like one of the only ways to really like deal with hidden information. Otherwise, you have like in like a convenient way. Randomness. Well, forget about it. Dice are awkward, clunky. I know we just talked about D20 and whatnot, but D20 is usually in the context of like the story of the role play. In this context, I kind of like ask you to imagine applying randomness to not the story of the role play, but rather to the world. For example, the clouds on the skybox as they go past are random, and that as opposed to being in a set pattern, right? Computers are really good at that. And the third thing is well, doing lots of things very quickly, far quicker than a person could ever do it. You can have a computer do much more than a person could ever do by themselves in a much shorter time. That's kind of the abstract answer. I feel like most things where if you think of like, well, this is an advantage of, systems in VR roleplay, like I think like most things will fall into one of these categories. Now, those are the advantages. Here's the current major disadvantage. The current thing that I think is holding VR roleplay back is UI, specifically UI. UI sucks. VR controllers suck. Trying to figure out like user interfaces that aren't awful is the hard part. Yeah, that is basically it.
Yeah, the motion tracking capabilities of VR have expanded light years from the time of the Wii with its little 2-point IR tracking.
Oh god.
But
yeah,
it's still
it's
really
good.
shaky.
It's really good, but like with the controllers that we have and like with the stuff that we have, like I've never like interacting with like a menu just feels clunky usually.
Yeah.
And you can have like I think like for example like the drag menu that like Neon Divide had for like the talk, yell, whatever. I think that's actually like better than whatever I did on the menu. But the thing is, even if you have a sort of like drag menu like that, where you don't have to look at it and you can just kind of move your hand in like a certain direction, you can fit so little, right? You can fit so few controls. And that's kind of like the big problem here is like we could do so much, but you're so limited with what you can control because in a convenient fashion, right? You can have like, a couple of gestures in your like UI, and there is like a maximum that you can access conveniently, after which point you're going to have to like interrupt whatever you're doing and like open the big menu and scroll through it and like take yourself out of all the advantages of being in VR the moment you do that.
I think that forces a consideration, right? Because like that I think is actually a really good limitation. I would wager, because the consideration there is what is required to be accessible to me at all times and what can be presented elsewhere. Because like realistically, the real space of a VR roleplay is the entire map, which means we could effectively make the entire map interactable via some sort of gesture, some sort of movement, which to me feels like one of the biggest strengths of VR. That being said, the current state of the standard UI and the easiest thing to implement is the point and click or the limited space in the play space around us, which tends to be very difficult to navigate. So it's like the what needs to be available to us anywhere, literally anywhere, versus like what we can interact with out in the world is definitely a consideration that has to be placed on top of that, which I think is a good consideration to have because then you ask questions like what needs to be immediately accessible when you're talking to someone. Do I need to be able to talk, whisper, yell? Usually, yes. Do I need to be able to move my menu up 5 pixels on my screen? No, usually not. So this is like a conversation I had with Phase Dragon when we were talking about the new Neonivide menu, which I actually really don't like. I don't like that menu much at all. I think it's good from an organizational perspective, from a programmatic perspective, but not from a usability perspective. And I've voiced that to Phase like several times. That realistically, it takes way more to get to the point where you're actually interacting with the thing you want, and by that point, you've already accessed this very non-diegetic menu through these much less gestural controls that takes you a lot more away from the roleplay than it does bring you into it. Which is then my thought to then think, how do you bring someone more into things? Right? And usually that comes down to being within the world, which means you're messing with things that are in the world instead of using specific controller controls. So I very heavily lean into these sort of like VR gesture menus because A, that just fits the VR medium better, and B, you can integrate those into the world in some capacity. They don't have to be embedded into this play space locked menu. You can have like a lever on a wall or like you can grab to open the door. Like
Yeah. Honestly, other than pinging for a DM and God forbid dice rolling, and of course talk, whisper, yell, I cannot figure out much in the way of things players actually need for a menu. The big clunky um, indexed menus like the phases menu system and ATK's blade system, those are much better only in the hands of DMs, I think, because they have all the game state and all the settings and like all these other things that aren't diegetic. Like the most diegetic thing on there is the potential for a quote unquote NPC light, where if you're on the sport cast, you can turn on a light for a dark map and see where you are. But other than that, I don't think players actually need menus. DMs, sure, but players, there's not a whole lot that they need that should be taking them out of the roleplay. Like, as you said, if they have certain spawnables that they need, they should have a place where they can spawn them, like a tool rack or something, rather than pulling them out of thin air.
right.
I think the backpack system, the menus that were involved in that for Blackwell, was most of the way there. As an inventory screen goes, it was rather basic and kind of annoying to deal with because VR. But it was as diegetic as you can get without actively making a rigged backpack that you could open up and look into and try to select things through there. It just popped up a grid square system saying, this is what's in here. You can grab this out with a trigger. And that is the extent of what that menu needed to do and the extent of what it did. So I think that was a success in terms of player UX. Forcing the player to go through a tutorial every single time they spawn on the map, not so helpful. Like it's cool that it tells you how to use the menu, but there's a lot of the menu that doesn't need to be used by the player. And there's, or except with the exception of like 3 major things, I think. One of which is like adjusting where your item belt pins to your model, or how far a backpack sits off the back of your model so it can line up correctly. Other than that, that's all preference menu stuff. You can have that in the spawn room, but
Right.
I don't think they need that for something like just normal roleplay.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And this this kind of encompasses my general thoughts of VR as well. But in every single circumstance where I think of the strengths of VR and how it engages with roleplay and how roleplay happens within it, I always I always think and look for ways to go further. Because we can do so much in VR, we can create completely unreal scenarios
Yeah.
that become real to us through our experience with them. And we can create these different ways to explore the human condition by thinking of like different kinds of characters, different kinds of worlds, different kinds of scenarios that we wouldn't normally be able to experience anywhere else. And because we are fully immersed in real time in our headsets throughout those experiences, that like the consideration of what we can do should extend as broadly as possible because we are absolutely open to almost literally anything that is possible. That can very, very potentially be a weakness in VR that everyone trying to do everything means that you end up with the kind of large amount of noise that usually happens in areas like the metaverse, for example. But I still think it is its greatest strength because we can access scale that we normally couldn't. We can access different types of stories that we normally couldn't. We can access different types of realities, different types of experiences that we normally couldn't. All of this is accessible. Like someone said, accessibility. All of this is accessible because we have the medium that is capable of doing it, and we have the level of immersion that VR allows us. So it is, in my understanding, and this is why I love VR roleplay so much, it is marrying the two perfect things to experience different kinds of experiences. It is marrying the full, the near full immersion of putting on the headset with the controllers with the effectively infinite possibility of what you can actually do in kind of a user-generated content sort of platform, which is why VR chat has been getting better and better for roleplay, especially allowing Udon, allowing the sort of programmatic freedom within worlds to create different ways to interact with them, along with Udon 2 coming out, is going to be wonderful. Having the persistence API, having different ways for us to create things that we don't necessarily need all these like manager objects. We could just have more consistent management.
Mention Udon too, the copium.
One day. Hoping for it. Maybe. At least, but it'll make it at the very least. Just thinking about it and thinking of the possibilities to make things easier to be created means that more things will be created. And in my mind, I still have, I still personally have the notion in my mind of like, does this fit what I'm going for? But I also have the back of my mind, which I'm not a very creative, but I can't like create things from thin air usually, so it's very hard for me. But I still think like, what kind of interesting things can we do? What kind of interesting experiences can we make real by tapping into VR as the fullest potential possible that it has? And realistically, like, there's so I'm ranting at this point, but there's so much.
Sorry. To answer your rant, I would say that it is the Batman versus Superman argument. What do you want to do? How much can you do? Well, how much preparation time you got? That's the extent of the argument. The only thing VR can't do very well right now is haptic feedback. The best you
Right.
got, if you don't spend $15,000 on a haptic vest rig or whatever how much it costs, is the vibration of a controller,
Yeah.
which can be quite expressive. Like if you run your hand along a wall, you can program it to feel like it's running along roughness, or like if a shockwave goes off, you can feel like it's more of a punch. But with the medium, if you put enough time into it, you can do nearly anything. I say nearly because there are some technical limitations of VRChat itself that make things wholly frustrating to deal with. Not impossible, just annoying. Like doing anything with any sort of immediacy, for one. VRChat has a pretty well baked in 500 millisecond delay because it is a social platform first, and they're doing a bunch of like pre-caching for phoneme recognition or something, and it slows down the networking a lot. And that can really, really screw with gunplay if you're trying to make the actual thing gamified and have impacts actually do like hit detection, which is one of the main things that we ran into with the finale for ATK, because we had tanks, hover tanks with moving turrets and weaponry. You'd be firing at somebody on your screen, but because of the huge latency and we didn't have any sort of dead reckoning or any sort of rollback code in place, the laser would appear a good 5 yards behind where you were actually aiming or more. But other than those very apparent and static limitations, telling a story, as long as you're willing to put up with preparation time, workload, and potentially graphics load, there's not a whole lot you can't do.
Sullen, any thoughts?
Actually, not at the moment.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, I just love the amount of Unreal that we can do. That's why I don't enjoy really any other role playing. I really enjoy the live action of VR. I don't enjoy IRL LARP. I think like having to struggle with things being far too real, but still trying to do unreal things just does not hit that for me. Like I watched a video sent to me. I think Neon sent it to me, where it was like this superhero LARP, and or like this hero high school or whatever, and that one of these characters was like a space fish that could that could make that could make the wind pick up or something like that. I forget what exactly the example was, but it was like see like this, and then I was like, whoa, I could feel it, and it's like, God, this is so weird. It just feels weird because none of this is actually happening. This person's clearly a person. They don't look like a space fish or whatever thing they were trying to say they were, and they're definitely not doing the thing. So it's like all of it is theater of the mind. All of it is you have to like lift it because the person's aiming for the thing, and they're saying they're doing the thing. So it's like, well, yeah, it's the thing is happening, but like VR can actually like make these happen. You can have the model that looks like the space fish. You can use wind effects and audio and particles and stuff to make the wind real.
You trigger to screw with the wind settings on terrain so the plants actually start to move.
You can't churn up someone's AC, unfortunately. I mean, you can, but it probably have to set up some crazy shit for it.
With an Arduino and something similar to what I'm doing with VTI, that's not impossible.
Yeah, it's not impossible. Yeah, it's not impossible, but it's like the setup. But that's just wild, right? That aside, it is certainly though one of those considerations. It's like we can actually do all this. We don't have to say We don't just have to talk about it. We can do it, right? And it's real time. So for me, that pulls away from all of the other like sort of RPGs, turn-based, tabletop, anything. Like basically all the tabletop stuff is very not real time because you have to focus on one thing at a time. You have to have one person doing a thing at a time. But in real time roleplay, you have different things happening at the same time, and that I think is super powerful. Although you don't have the full context like you would want to have in like an improv scene or scenario, you still have the world moving in different ways in different places, and I think that's so cool.
And I think we somehow missed talking about the timescale thing with the D20 section.
Timescale.
I don't think we covered that. Like in the D20 came from a turn-based roleplay system, and we're trying to shoehorn a turn-based system into real time, so it just bogs everything down. So that's a little callback, tangential callback to that section. I'll just leave that at that, so we don't get carried away.
That's true. I'll close it out. It is very true that it does bog down when you use it, right? It's something that it owns its own space and doesn't integrate very well with the space around it. So you have to spend the time to process the role, to talk about what happens with it, and that takes away from the roleplay.
Yeah. And back away from the tangent, I was having a conversation with someone a few weeks ago. I can't remember who it was. But we were talking, and I made the argument that I believe that VR chat roleplay has the potential to be more immersive than LARP. And there's arguments against that, of course. But actually, I think I was on 404 server that I was having this. But like in a LARP, you're always in that scenario. There's no logging out and going back to the spawn room or whatever. So you feel like you're actually there. But in VR chat roleplay, or VR roleplay rather, that may not be the case, but you can have the platform itself set your setting for you. So instead of paying 30 people to set up a good $20,000 worth of set pieces, the world itself can be like asset packs thrown in, but it's still your setting. And VR roleplay allows you to put truth to the matter. Like, I'm casting Fireball in a LARP, I throw a sandbag at somebody or roll a dice with a little popper thing. In VR, I can throw the Fireball.
Yeah. I think the determination that we actually talked about this a couple episodes ago. I don't remember which one. The determination that we came up with is not that it's more immersive, because 360 LARP is not possible in VR. Which is effectively you're always in character for the allotted time of the roleplay, even when you are eating, showering, sleeping, whatever. It is still part of the roleplay. VR doesn't allow that. So it's less immersive in the very definitive sense of being immersed, or the capability of being immersed, but the breadth of immersion that it allows and the amount of things that you can be immersed in is where VR excels. So it's like it is more there are more immersive possibilities, but it's less immersive.
Yeah, specifically it is the breadth versus depth argument.
Basically.
Where it's not like more immersive in magnitude, but you can become immersed in more things. There are more things that you can make immersive in VR.
And fewer things take you out of the situation.
Right.
Granted, I haven't seen anyone's pelvis fly to the stratosphere in real life, but I have also not seen anyone do a LARP and actually stack pole a mech. So there's that.
Haven't seen anyone teleport with a horse-drawn carriage. Yeah, fun. VR scuff is the funny. It is definitely the funny. Okay, so we didn't really comment on the time, but we are very much
Yeah,
over
I
our
will.
usual.
I will
So,
comment on the time.
will you?
How long do you usually go?
2 to 3 hours.
Sorry.
Oh, it's all no. We all got into it. This is a great discussion, honestly. But we definitely time boxing is not our strong suit. We tend to have some asides here and there, but it is what it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and lead us into a closing here. To remind everyone before we finish out this podcast, if y'all got any questions to bring up in the chat or within the stage channel in the Discord, feel free to do so. But while that is going on, if y'all are typing those in, so to close this out, this has been the On the Couch podcast, where apparently Waffle becomes wide by spending 700 channel points, and we talk about Couchform, the school of thoughts that focuses on building around a core theme, designing to support those themes, and playing to live the scenarios within it. I'm going to go ahead and once again put that Couchform command into the chat. Stream Elements will put that first link, which is the principles themselves that Couchform is based on, and the Myriad Discord server where we talk about roleplay and expand on some of the ideas within Couchform and other styles as well. There have been some other very different but very interesting, well thought out styles that people have shared in that server, and it's been awesome to give people the space to do that. And besides that, I guess Waffle, do you have anything that you want to share that you will be working on? Anything exciting coming up?
Well, my free time is going to be drastically reduced in the next week because I have finally got myself out of the unemployment rut of the past year.
There
So
you
that's
go.
fun. One day, eventually, I will go and actually release VTI or VRChat Twitch integration. It does not really work well with VRChat roleplay like we've been talking here, but it's still fun to have Twitch chat be able to screw with the world. Other than that, I have 18 trillion ideas kicking around in my head. Maybe one day I'll do one. Other than that, follow me on the Twitter and the Patreon and the whatever the hell else.
All right. Sounds good to me. Any closing statements, Selin?
Sure. I suppose we were talking about the skybox earlier. I have more or less already released the Worlds Apart skybox in the Worlds Apart server, minus the shader, because technically I did not make the shader entirely by myself. I kind of cannibalized another shader in the making of that. But if anybody wants a kind of overly complicated solar system skybox thing, I've got you covered. I'm more than willing to help people set something like that up.
Cool. I might have to hit you up for that as I make this map.
It's,
Maybe later.
It's a bit overly complicated, not very performant unless we roll our own shader, which I suppose I could do now. I haven't done it yet, but yeah. Anyway.
Maybe I'll go simple. Who knows? Regardless, if there are no questions, then we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Oh my god.
Lied.
You're wild for that. All right.
There we go.
This has been the On the Couch podcast. Thank you, Waffle, for joining us here. Been a wonderful conversation. Glad to have listened through and had you share those the insight of your experience developing and working with different kinds of systems. It's been awesome.
Yeah. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So that has been episode 8. Next week, next Sunday, we'll be talking about principle number 9 of Couchform, which is truth is a shared responsibility. So you players as well can get involved with establishing some truths within your role plays, not just depending on the GMs to do it for you.
You can't handle the truth.
Yes, you can. All right, everybody, take care.
Till next. The most powerful truth.
No, it's mine. Anyways, y'all take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.